NY24. A few of these shelter facilities, but the majority are run by nonprofit service providers under contract with DHS under the oversight of DHS. As part of contracts with DHS, providers agree to comply with fiscal management and governance requirements set by the city. In October of this year, 2024, the Department of Investigation, known as DOI, released a report after an extensive review of the compliance risks at 51 nonprofit service providers that operate a majority of the city's homeless shelters. The report, which was a follow-up to one that was done in 21, found numerous cases of conflicts of interest, related third-party transactions, nepotism, non-compliance with competitive bidding requirements, and excessive executive compensation, which is really hard to understand. In order to address this, DOI made 32 policy and procedure recommendations to address these system-wide vulnerabilities, including 23 recommendations that DOI first made as part of their 2021 report that I mentioned. In response, the Department of Social Services and the Department of Homeless Services and MOX, which is the agency that governs much of this in terms of day-to-day, passport, et cetera, partially accepted or rejected the recommendations. We look forward today to finding out what progress has been made in implementing the recommendations the agencies accepted and examining why the agency rejected some of the DOI recommendations. I want to just mention, when looking at the one that seemed most egregious to me was when it says TBA, or there's no listing of a contractor or subcontractor. That should be rejected. On the other hand, I'm very conscious of the fact that it's hard to get the city to pay, and what you don't want is agencies not to be paid as a result of the money that's already been allocated by the nonprofit. So it's a hard issue to address. I'm aware of that. I'm big on AI. I think it would solve all your problems in that aspect. I want to thank the committee staff, Nicole Catada, Alex Yablon, and here Erica Cohen for their work in putting this hearing together, as well as Sam Goldsmith, who is the Communications and Policy Director in my office. I will now turn this hearing over to Chair Ayala to give her opening statement, and then others will follow.
Thank you, Chair Brewer, and good morning, everyone. My name is Diana Ayala, and I am the Deputy Speaker of the New York City Council and the Chair of the General Welfare Committee. As the chair of the Committee on General Welfare, I believe it is imperative that our shelter systems not only serve individuals seeking shelter in an efficient and effective manner, but also that DSS and DHS are able to support this work in a transparent and accountable way. As Chair Brewer mentioned, our 4 committees are here today to discuss the troubling findings of the recently released report for the Department of Investigations on Oversight of Shelter Providers and the issues related to compliance with existing contracts and city policies. We are looking forward to hearing from representatives of DSS and DHS about the findings in the report as well as the recommendations provided. I know my colleagues would agree that we at the City Council look forward to collaborating with our partners at DSS to better serve New Yorkers and to ensure that all compliance requirements are met. Additionally, we will be hearing today a bill in General Welfare Introduction 979 sponsored by Chair Wan in relation to reporting on shelter food consumption and providing the repeal thereof. We look forward to hearing the administration's thoughts on this legislation as well. I would like to thank my fellow committee chairs for coming together for this important hearing today, and I would also like to thank the committee staff from all 4 committees who worked hard to prepare this hearing, including committee staff for General Welfare, Sahar Mozami, Legislative Counsel, Nina Rosenberg, Policy Analyst, Julia Haramis, Unit Head, Faria Rahman, Finance Analyst, Andrew Skull, Data Analyst, and finally my staff, Elsie Encarnacion, Chief of Staff. I would now like to turn it to Chair Brennan for his opening statement.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker Ayala, and good morning. Along with my co-chairs, I'm eager to discuss the Department of Investigation's report and recommendations. I'm also eager to address the unacceptable findings of the ongoing compliance and governance issues that have led to the misuse of public funding in providing the essential services of temporary shelter. As chair of the Finance Committee, I look forward to a robust discussion around the need for strong oversight mechanisms to ensure municipal funds are used for the purposes for which they are directed and intended. The administration has the duty and responsibility to manage city funds with prudence to ensure city funds authorized for public services are in fact serving the public, not friends, family, or private interests. It concerns me greatly that our city can't get their act together long enough to pay our critical human service nonprofit sector on time for critical services rendered, and yet blank checks to outside vendors and no-bid emergency contracts seem to flow like a never-ending freshwater stream through City Hall. As mentioned by my co-chairs, the public services contracts implicated in today's discussions are some of the largest the city enters in terms of cost. They demand careful inspection from the council and close attention from the agencies charged with procuring and monitoring them. Recommendations from DOI to ensure the lawful and prudent use of public funds in connection with these contracts deserve both scrutiny and quick action. I look forward to a productive hearing and learning more about how DSS, DHS, and MOX are working together to root out the issues uncovered in DOI's investigations. Ultimately, when the dust settles and the frantic fog of an emergency subsides, every single dime of taxpayer money still must be accounted for. This is not monopoly money. Lax procurement oversight and little to no safeguards against corruption only serve to further erode public trust in our local government and systems. I'm grateful to the staff who put this hearing together and worked hard behind the scenes, including staff of the Finance Division in preparation for this hearing, counsel to the division, Nick Connell, and financial analysts, Faria Rahman, Michael Sherman, and Owen Katowski. I'll now turn it over to Chair Wan for her opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Chairs Brewer, Ayala, and Brannon, for convening this important hearing and for your leadership on this critical issue. My name is Julie Wan, and I have the privilege of chairing the Council's Committee on Contracts. As we've heard, today's hearing examines deeply concerning issues for the city's oversight of shelter providers. From my committee's perspective, I want to focus particularly on contracting and procurement challenges identified in DOI's report. I'm so proud to sponsor Intro 979, which would require annual reporting on food consumption of shelters and recommendations for improving both food quality and cost effectiveness. Given the food service is one of the key contracted service in our shelter system and a basic necessity for survival, this data will be invaluable for evaluating vendor performance and ensuring we're getting the best value for residents and taxpayers. Beyond the troubling invoice and payment issues my colleagues have mentioned, I'm particularly concerned about the concentration of contracts among just 17 nonprofit contractors that comprise 65% of the city's non-migrant shelter capacity. This creates significant systemic risk that must be addressed through our procurement strategy. If any one of these major providers were to face operational challenges or have their contracts terminated, we could lose thousands of shelter beds overnight. The city needs a clear contingency plan for such scenarios. I'm also deeply troubled by DOI's findings about the city's payment and oversight process. When providers can submit and receive approval for invoices with over $117 million in unspecified vendors, it suggests a fundamental weakness in the city's contract management systems. These gaps are particularly concerning given that shelter contracts represent 3 of the city's top 10 largest contracts overall and 9 of the top 10 largest human services contracts. The planned transition of emergency shelter operations back to DHS by FY 2026 adds another layer of complexity to these procurement challenges. While these consolidations may offer opportunities to strengthen oversight, it will require careful planning and robust contract management protocols to execute successfully. We need to ensure our procurement approach anticipates and addresses potential challenges before they arise. The committee will be particularly interested in hearing how DSS, DHS, and MOX plan to implement DOI's recommendations regarding vendor integrity, monitoring, and contract oversight. We need specific details about how the city will strengthen its review processes while ensuring timely payment to the providers who deliver these essential services. Before we begin, I would like to thank senior staff, Senior Counsel Alex Polinoff, Policy Analyst Alex Yablon, Senior Financial Analyst Owen Katowski, Unit Head Jack Story, and all the other committee staff members for their hard work in putting this hearing together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I turn it over to committee counsel to administrate the oath, I want to say thank for joining us, Councilmember Farias, Caban, Aviles, Carr, and Osei, but also on Zoom, Moya and Brooks Powers, and I'll turn it over to council. Thank you very much.
Will you please raise your right hand? Do you affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth before these committees and to respond honestly to council member questions?
I do.
I do.
I do.
Thank you. You can begin when ready.
Great. Good morning. I want to thank the City Council's committees on Oversight and Investigations, General Welfare, Finance, and Contracts. Chairs Brewer, Ayala, Brannon, and Juan for organizing today's hearing on administration oversight of city-funded homeless shelter providers. My name is Molly Wasso Park, and I serve as the Commissioner of the Department of Social Services, DSS, which is made up of the Human Resources Administration and the Department of Homeless Services. I'm joined today by Bedros Leon Budanian, Chief Accountability Officer at the Department of Social Services, and Charles Diamond, Special Counsel at the Mayor's Office of Contract Services. The New York City Department of Social Services is the nation's largest social services agency, and DHS is the nation's largest and most comprehensive municipal shelter system. DHS serves individuals and families experiencing homelessness, and through our shelters and programs, we support people through a traumatic and challenging moment in their lives. Working to prevent homelessness and provide shelter to adults and families, we partner with providers to deliver housing, support, and help in the transition towards safe, permanent housing. The Mayor's Office of Contract Services, MOCS, is dedicated to optimizing existing operations and transforming processes to make it easier to do business with the city. MOCS's mission is to lead procurement transformation by leveraging expertise, innovation, and a results-oriented mindset. DSS works with MOCS to strengthen transparency and accountability in the procurement process. I appreciate the opportunity to review our oversight of city-funded homeless shelter providers with you today. The overwhelming majority of DHS shelters are operated by a network of experienced temporary housing providers under contract with the agency. Each of these contracted providers has been selected and vetted through our open-ended RFP process that factors in capacity, experience, and site location, among other things. During the course of the provider contract, DSS Agency Chief Contracting Officer, the ACO, and the Accountability Office, also known as AO, along with DHS shelter operations, regularly engage with the shelter provider to ensure compliance with contract terms and quality of services. Serving those experiencing homelessness is incredibly important human services work, and the overwhelming majority of the not-for-profit partners and community organizations, made up of countless social workers, housing specialists, lawyers, clinicians, public servants, and many more, are engaged in this work for exactly the right reasons. We want to lift our fellow New Yorkers up, deliver assistance through a vulnerable moment, and help our neighbors. At DSS, we recognize the importance of accountability. In most instances, providers are trying to do the right thing, and we understand that compliance is complex. Our goal and our approach to compliance is to support providers and, where necessary, help serve as a constructive partner in getting them to a place where they can succeed through remediation. Our structure of proactive contract monitoring focuses on three compliance tenets: evaluate, monitor, and remediate. DSS uses and has expanded the scope of evaluation strategies to include audits, risk assessments, performance reporting, research, and investigations. DSS is expanding the evaluation strategy to include real-time secondary invoice review for high-risk categories. This expanded evaluation strategy includes review by executive staff and contract managers, including our vendor management committee. On monitoring, DSS recently created a corrective action planning office designed to monitor and evaluate corrective actions stemming from internal and external audits, investigations, and reviews. This includes tracking compliance for DHS vendors that have been placed on corrective action plans. CAPO tracks issues, ensuring completion and compliance, and notes repeat issues across providers or programs. DHS uses policies and procedures, direct memos to providers, and training as remediation strategies. In 2025, compliance-related issues will be incorporated into more provider trainings. Recent trainings include the comprehensive MOCS standard invoice review policy training for all contract managers. Recent policies and guidance include the citywide anti-nepotism policy, timekeeping requirements, allocation methodology, and more. Also in 2025, the agency will be creating a new unit of field staff to assist high-risk providers on various compliance-related matters. The Department of Investigation commenced its investigation of the DHS provider contract process in 2021. During the multi-year investigation, DSS-DHS made every effort to work with DOI to ensure the investigation factored in the most accurate and current information. In fact, DSS-DHS served as a partner in presenting the processes we undertake to scrutinize vendors, flag problems, and follow up where standards are not being met. In October 2024, DOI published its Shelter Provider Report. While the report highlights much of the multi-year engagement between our agencies, I believe the report did not wholly convey the operational and regulatory context DSS operates within, delineate changes over time so as to reflect current DSS-DHS operations, or present the proactive role DSS plays in detecting, investigating, and holding vendors to account. With respect to the operational and regulatory context within which DSS operates, I will share that the larger landscape of oversight and regulation feeds into DOI observations in ways that are not taken into account in the report. For instance, in discussing nonprofit executive salaries, 2 points are particularly salient. First, DSS does not directly pay not-for-profit executive salaries. Agency leadership is considered an overhead cost that is paid out of the provider's indirect rate. That indirect cost reimbursement goes towards central staff cost as well as other costs like office space and supplies. Second, some providers may have operations that extend well beyond the contracts they hold with DSS, which means the agency cannot issue unilateral directives on executive compensation. The DOI report also failed to take account of New York State's shared role in oversight and enforcement. New York State has broad oversight authority over not-for-profits, and state-level actors can play a constructive role in ensuring not-for-profits meet their legal obligations, exercising state authority to enjoin, void, or rescind a related party transaction. With respect to current DSS operations, DSS had already taken steps to address problematic providers that the DOI report identifies. Well before the report was released, or in some instances before the report was initiated, DSS had completely ceased doing business with some providers, for example, CORE, CCS, and SOBRO, and has placed other providers on closely monitored corrective action plans, Bronx Parent and Acacia. DSS places vendors on corrective action plans, CAPs, when the vendor is experiencing serious challenges, which could be related to organizational structure, fiscal compliance, or other compliance issues. These CAPs are specifically drafted to address each vendor's unique issues. Vendors are required to immediately address the problems that led to the CAP and must submit quarterly reporting demonstrating CAP compliance for up to 5 years. DSS closely monitors CAP quarterly submissions and communicates with the vendor to remedy any failures of CAP compliance. With respect to the proactive role DSS plays in detecting, investigating, and holding vendors to account, the DOI report does not acknowledge the manifold ways that DSS has been integral to this process. DSS may flag potential fiscal mismanagement or malfeasance, initiate investigations, or demand forensic audits, all of which comprise essential elements of bringing problems to light and holding providers who fail to meet their legal obligations accountable. DSS has been a proactive participant in enforcing compliance up to and including making referrals to DOI for further investigation. But beyond identifying bad actors, DSS works to foster and build the city's capacity to engage with vendors who uphold the rules. DSS is an active part of the city's vendor compliance cabinet, sharing best practices, developing risk metrics, and constructively partnering to advance citywide policies to advance contract monitoring and oversight citywide. We understand that working across our city with fellow public procurement and contracting professionals, we contribute to building a more robust ecosystem of reliable vendors. Turning our attention to the legislation being heard today, Introduction 979 would require annual reports for 5 years as to shelter food consumption. The proposed study would include assessing the quality of food for each shelter, calculating the percent of food consumed relative to the amount of food served at each shelter and at shelters in the aggregate, providing recommendations for more cost-effective food provision, and providing recommendations on improving quality of food at shelters. We share the Council's goal of ensuring clients are served nutritious, healthy food that meets New York City food standards, but do not feel that the proposed legislation as drafted would be a productive use of city resources to assist in meeting our shared goal. We would like to engage in a more in-depth discussion on the work underway at DSS to upgrade our monitoring of food quality and how this legislation could potentially complement those efforts. Operationally, we want to ensure that we can deliver reliable data. The parameters the legislation sets out around calculating food consumed by shelter site would be particularly challenging to operationalize. There are also important technical modifications that we would highlight. In addition to making sure the metrics can be operationalized by providers, we would seek to include appropriate provisions for New York State laws on privacy and avoiding identifying locations of residential programs for victims of domestic violence. I will conclude by saying that DSS aims for providers to comply with all their contractual, legal, and regulatory obligations, and more broadly, to nurture a culture of ethics and accountability. At DSS, we understand the need for our partners to deliver for our clients. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. We are happy to take your questions.
Thank you. We've been joined by Councilmember Williams and Powers. So I'll start and then turn it over to my colleagues. I'll just do a few because I know there are a lot of us. I want to thank you, Commissioner. I also want to thank Director Carter for always answering my emails. And I like you too, but you always say no, Commissioner. I just want to let you know. Just FYI. So to date, how many providers does the department fund to provide shelter services? I don't think it said so in your material.
We are working with 87 different providers.
87, okay. And what is the current budget for the DHS devoted to providing shelter through nonprofit providers?
The total budget for the agency is about $4 billion. We'll get back to you with the specifics on how that breaks out with PS, separating out the streets, other things like that. I'm sorry, we got the specific budget questions fairly late yesterday, so we'll need to circle back.
And are all of the 87 nonprofits, or are you running some?
The 87 are the contracted agencies. We also operate, I believe it's 8 sites directly.
8. So 87 plus 8.
Yeah, I mean, and many of the shelter providers within that 87 operate more than
Right.
one shelter, certainly. So it's 87 contracted entities.
No, I understand that. How many separate units within DHS or DSS combined are involved in the contracting process with providers? How many separate units?
So it's really embedded throughout what we do. I would divide it high level into 3 different categories of areas where there is contract monitoring and engagement, but it starts very much with the DHS staff, right? So the way we are structured, we have program analysts reporting up to program administrators, each of whom have a portfolio of providers. They are out on the sites on a regular basis. Their job is to observe what is going on, make sure that policies and procedures are being followed, provide technical assistance. They are doing both performance management and contract management. So they are looking, for example, at how many move-outs, permanent housing placements that each shelter is doing. They're also doing the invoice review for providers.
Let's talk about that invoice issue then. Go ahead.
Okay. So, let me give the landscape of how we are addressing contract management. So the DHS frontline staff are very much embedded in that contract management process and making sure that providers, whether financially or programmatically, are doing what they are supposed to do. We also have our accountability office. As I mentioned, I'm joined here by our chief accountability officer. They are filling a range of different functions. So they are recommending providers for enhanced review. This is a citywide structure where providers that have run into some level of challenge on financial management have a higher level of scrutiny before invoices are approved. They're doing independent audits contracted with third-party auditors. They're monitoring incident data. So this is, issues that come up on site. We are mandated to report those to the state. They're looking at that incident data, make sure we are complying with our reporting requirements and looking at any patterns. They have, as I mentioned in my testimony, our vendor management committee. This brings together people from all across the agency to make sure that we aren't losing sight of either issues or potential solutions in our various programmatic silos across DHS and HRA. They have an investigative team to be able to do in-depth follow-up on particular issues that might be identified, and then they monitor and track the CAPs, corrective action plans. And then the third very important piece of our contract management component is our agency chief contracting officer, our ACO. They are obviously the ones doing the actual hands-on work of contracting with our providers. That includes, among many other pieces of it, the responsibility determination, which is part of the citywide process that looks at the vendor's ultimate accountability with various requirements.
Okay. back to my AI question, and I mean, why wouldn't that be helpful? Or maybe you're already doing it with some of the, particularly, I would say, the oversight of what is presented from the nonprofits.
Interesting suggestion. I have to say, I don't know that we've specifically looked at AI, although I will let my Mox colleague chime in. I will say, we take invoice review very seriously. What is submitted can look very different from provider to provider, right? We are looking for the same.
Like from council member to council member, yes.
We are looking at specific documentation. We don't always prescribe exactly the same format because we want to give providers some level of flexibility. To address the issue that you raised in your opening statement and that was in the DOI report about the $117 million that was didn't have a vendor attached to it. Couple of things. First, we actually did go in, pulled the backup on a number of those different instances. In every case that we looked at, the backup with the appropriate vendor was attached to the case. So what was missing was the name of the vendor listed in the system. That doesn't make it okay, but but we did not find any instances associated with that of inappropriate payments. So we can still do better. We are doing better. One of the, the city has rolled out the passport system for invoice payments since the DOI investigation was done. Through those system changes that was made and the staff training that went along with that, there's no longer an opportunity to make a payment if that vendor isn't listed actually in the system. But I do want to really emphasize that although it was a problem that we did not accurately list the vendor in the system, there was no we did not identify any instance of mispayment in those cases.
AI would have caught it, just FYI.
Chair, if I may, I
Yeah,
do
please,
want to
I'm big on AI, as you can see. Go
Yes,
ahead.
indeed. No,
I
I
use it all the time. I love it.
Yeah, and I think exactly that. We're also big on AI. There are challenges. I think just as the commissioner just said, we're, in particular from Mox's perspective, I think equity is a concern when we talk about AI. We've done so much work to reverse the horrible, horrible statistics that we saw in this city for its contracting, and we're finally at a place where we're meeting the goals that we've had, but we have a lot more work to do, and we can't let AI take that backwards.
No,
but I'd say we're looking at AI in all aspects when it comes to writing solicitations, reading solicitations, invoice review. It's at an early stage still, but as part of our procurement reform portfolio, that is absolutely something that is top of mind, and we've had discussions with various commissioners about how they think it might help their contracting team. So under active
All right, I
discussion.
won't belabor it. How long, just generally, for some of these contracts with the nonprofit providers, how long are the contract terms? And then I think you answered this, but the scheduled check-ins to review the status of the contracts, how is that actually done? The length and the check-in?
So we have two typical human service contracts, and there are contracts that we have with, cleaning vendors and things like that that might look slightly different, but I'm speaking specifically about the human services. The bulk of them are 5-year contracts with a 4-year renewal period. So that is the majority of what we have. We have also increasingly been doing what we refer to as our not-for-profit owned contract model for shelters. These are longer term, generally 30-year contracts where the not-for-profit is able to use the term of that contract to leverage private debt and then do their own shelter development. So rather than leasing a site from a for-profit landlord, that they are able to develop and build their own site. I am very excited about that model. I think it offers a lot of benefits. The not-for-profits control their own destiny. The real estate is an asset on their balance sheet. They are responsible for doing their own, maintenance and operation. They're not at the whim of any private landlord. So that is a benefit to the not-for-profit. It's a benefit to the client because the buildings are being built as shelter. They're not an adaptation of something that may or may not have the appropriate community service space, recreation space, things like that, and they're of value to the city because we are paying a fixed real estate cost every over a 30-year period. In the 9-year contracts, there's a rent escalator every 3 years, and then obviously at the 9-year mark, there is an opportunity for the landlord to renegotiate. So it is cost effective for us to do those longer term contracts. It does make for very large contracts, and I know that has gotten some attention, but they are at the end of the day quite cost effective. We have 43 of those ranging from in operation to in the pre-development stage.
Also, how long do the audits take? That's the other question I had. Well, same issue. How long does an audit typically take from when you audit the providers?
I'll let my colleague chime in, but that is something that's going to vary tremendously depending on the scope of both the audit itself and the provider, right? If we are doing an audit of, if our third-party contracted auditor is doing, or controller, city or state controller, right, is doing an audit of a particular shelter, that might be relatively quick. If they are doing an audit of a provider with a large footprint, that's going to take a lot longer.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, so in terms of our audit cycles, we try to limit them to a particular year for a fiscal year we're evaluating. To further illustrate that, from 2022 to 2024, we performed fiscal audits for 2 fiscal years, where the audits we oversaw, there were 186 of them, and auditors tested $350 million of invoices.
So you're trying to keep the 186 within that fiscal year is what you're saying?
That was over a little more than 2 years, and that was 2 fiscal years. It was fiscal year 2020 and fiscal year 2021.
Okay, and one more question, then turn it over to my colleague. So I think the issue, of course, this is both MOX and DSS, but the issue is when you submit an expense report that has errors, obviously we want the errors to be corrected, we want the expense report to be correct, but what's the typical process for correcting the error, and how long does that take? Now, also you hear, people are borrowing money to be able to pay so that they can pay their staff, and then, of course, they have to pay the interest on that borrowing. So there's a lot of concern from the nonprofit community. MOX hears about this all the time. DSS hears about this all the time. I hear about this all the time. So the question is, there's an error, then there's an error. There's the punctuation error, and then there's the serious financial error. So I just wonder, how are you dealing with the time frame, and how just generally are you trying to speed up both? Maybe you need more staff. Obviously, you want to make sure, and that's what the report is all about, that it's done correctly. So just give me a little sense of the timing and how you're dealing with the insignificant errors versus the real errors, and how we're going to deal with some of these nonprofits that are paying, gazillion dollars, $28,000 a month. I'm not going to mention which one, but that was somebody who's doing that just to borrow the money to pay the staff until they get reimbursed.
Thank you, Councilmember. I think you hit on the tension very well, right? We want to do things carefully and with thorough review, and also quickly. And those two things are sometimes in conflict. So let me describe what we do now and some of the changes we're making, and then I'll ask my colleagues to chime in. For family providers, so that's both families with children and also adult families, they are typically paid upfront at the beginning of the month. We'd make what is called a care day advance. So that is a state-approved per diem times the number of beds, and they get that upfront. To the extent that they have any additional expenses that aren't incorporated into that state per diem, then they invoice after the fact, and we will review and approve. For single adult and street providers, it's only that after the fact invoice process. So they typically invoice at the middle of the following month. So right now we're starting to get the November invoices, for example. For a provider that is not on enhanced review, we will do a fairly top-line prepayment review, looking at some payroll records, a few other high-level checks and balances, and then more of that review process happens after payment. So we do a post-payment audit. For providers that are on enhanced review, which, as I mentioned, anybody who has had certain levels of financial challenges in the past, then we are doing a more thorough review upfront. How long that process takes can vary substantially, again, based on enhanced reviews or not enhanced review, how complicated the invoice is. But we are actively working with MOCs right now. They've been issuing guidance that allows us to be a bit more nimble. For example, they just put out guidance on how to make a partial payment, right? So that if a part of the invoice is fine, a part of the invoice has some challenges, that we can move forward with the part that is fine. We appreciate their guidance. We absolutely recognize that we are in a challenging place with respect to payments right now. The city last year migrated to the passport system for invoice review. I am fully confident in the long run that that is going to make all of our lives better, more efficient, and more accountable, but it has been a challenging migration. In addition, DHS has a 50% more contracts than it did a couple of years ago, so that's also challenging. We are working with MOCs on really a full court press to make sure that we are getting payments out to nonprofits as quickly as possible while retaining that accountability. Just to put a little bit of context on it, since the beginning of November, so about a 6-week period, DHS has paid $288 million and HRA another $68 million. So we are working on getting money out to our provider community. We know we have more work to do. We are committed to it. And to really balancing that with the accountability.
Just a question, and then on the non-enhanced, do you have some sense of how many have had to borrow and what their cost is of doing that? Is that something you track?
We don't track it on a quantitative basis. Certainly, we have heard that from providers as well. I am aware that this is a top priority for the agency, that we need to do
This is
better.
a waste of money. So just a total waste of money.
The agency absolutely needs to do better on balancing that accountability and prompting.
Is that something that you could get us in terms of that information?
We can do a survey of our providers, but
I would appreciate that. I think it would help all of us to understand what the real issue is. I'm not talking about the enhanced, but particularly for the non-enhanced, as you call them. Okay. Now I want to turn it over to my council member, but I first want to recognize Council Member Ressler, Zwang, Botcher, and Vernikoff, and Council Member Ayala.
You did up to 7, right? You did up to 7?
Yep.
Thank you, Chair Brewer. How does DHS ensure that providers are complying with other requirements, such as the requirements around record retention, conflicts of interest, and nepotism?
Sure. So there are a number of disclosures that are required, whether when renewing a contract, entering into a contract. These are policies, some of which are in place already, some of which are things that we're building out. I'll let my MOCs colleagues chime in as well. But let me pause for a minute on the nepotism one, which I think is particularly challenging. Nepotism is obviously a word that has very negative connotations. In practice, what we found is it can mean a variety of different things, right? So we have instances and have seen instances where two siblings are motivated by the desire to serve their communities, found an organization together. That is not inherently a bad thing, right? We've also seen instances where, a parent gives their child a no-show job, and that is clearly a huge problem. So we want to make sure that we are doing an adequate review of individual circumstances. DHS created a nepotism policy that dictates how we do those individual reviews and sets out clear guidance for the provider community. That DSS policy ultimately became the basis for the citywide nepotism policy. So now if there are related parties in the leadership of an organization, they need to submit a waiver request to MOCs. MOCs reviews it, the agency reviews it, and we determine whether or not to grant it. But I'll let MOCs chime in on some more of that.
Yes, indeed. I would say, so that, as the Commissioner just said, that DHS policy really rolled up into becoming what is now a citywide policy that became effective in April of 2024. So there's that new anti-nepotism policy, and I would take a step back and say this has all kind of come out of the growth of, as referenced in the DOI report, the beginning of the MOCs Vendor Integrity Unit, which is housed within MOCs, and then the Vendor Compliance Cabinet, which is co-chaired by Director Flores of MOCs and Executive Director Lebec of MORMEC. and then has our procuring agencies, has the law department, has Mons and law will come in and give support. And through that kind of clearinghouse, we've developed this anti-nepotism policy that DHS was the leader on. And then we have that are really right at the kind of final stages, our conflicts of interest policy specific to that issue, and then a related party transactions specific policy. And this VCC, the Vendor Compliance Cabinet, it's really something that's desperately been needed and something that we're really looking forward to expanding. It's in stage 1 as we're building these out. It's developed a charter to have stakeholders understand these policies, right? So these policies have been discussed with vendors for over a year. No more surprises, no more, oh my gosh, what do I have to do? That's certainly the goal, and so we have our anti-nepotism policy that is active and effective. We have our an enhanced conflict of interest and enhanced related party transaction policy that is at that final stages with, actually, the Vendor Compliance Cabinet meets this afternoon on those 2 policies. So all of these exact issues, I think the Commissioner phrased it very well. It's somewhat more nuanced. We use the word nepotism is obviously inherently awful, and that no-show job she described, that's going to be violative of 15 other parts of your contract. But we've got to give our agencies the tools to find this stuff out. And I think crucially, as Chair Brewer said, do it not at the invoice stage. All of these policies, all of these things are things that can start to be done at the pre-qualification stage, the responsibility stage, things that can be done so that how can we minimize risk to the greatest extent possible without slowing anything down? Because as we know, the system is already inherently way too slow. So we can't afford to just hit it with a hammer. But it's very exciting with the Vendor Compliance Cabinet to have already had an effective policy out. We've got more in the pipeline, and there's also things surrounding that are still in work.
So is the nepotism policy just for leadership?
So it addresses supervisory lines, right? If there are 2 caseworkers from the same family, frontline staff people, that's not inherently a problem.
Okay, because I've heard, I've had situations where folks have, in conversation brought up, like, I work at the shelter, and like my supervisor hired his cousin who now runs, is managing the program, and then she hired her sister, and so those people wouldn't necessarily be in leadership, but when the whole family is running the shelter, then it can become problematic.
Yes, absolutely, and that is something that we would follow up on and enforce as appropriate.
But is there any language in the policy that prohibits that? Is there any type of disclosure that is required of whoever's overseeing that specific site in relation to the nepotism policy?
I'll have to recheck the policy for that specifically, but I do know the policy does govern direct chain of command, direct oversight. It prohibits supervisors from having the ability to oversee performance evaluations of their family members. Whether that goes down to supervisor or employee, I'll need to confirm.
Yeah, if there isn't a policy, I think that there has to be one, and if there is one, then I don't think people will understand or are complying, because I've heard it more than enough times to get that is a thing within, the shelter system.
We'll be happy
Smaller
to follow up
shelters
with you
primarily.
offline
Yeah.
to get specifics.
Okay. In 2021, DOI issued a separate report on oversight for nonprofit human service contracts and included 23 policy recommendations that continue to be relevant for the 2024 report that led to this hearing. Can DHS provide updates on its implementation of the relevant recommendations?
Sure. So just by way of context, the 2021 report was really human services sector across the board. DHS was actually a relatively small piece of that one. So the recommendations pertained to city-wide practices. So I'm going to pass the mic to Mox.
I'm sorry, Councilmember, what was the question?
So the question was, the DOI issued a separate report on oversight of nonprofit human service contracts in 2021 and included 23 policy recommendations that continue to be relevant for the 24 report that led to this hearing. Can DHS provide updates on its implementation of the relevant recommendations?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Chair, in terms of building off of that 2021 and moving towards where we are, I think, as the commissioner put it well, most of what DOI is talking about in this 2024 report references work that we have already doing. So I think starting in 2021, you had the implementation of the, I think it was the standard invoice review process, SIRP. And that, I think exactly as the commissioner and the chief accountability officer were talking about, that's that enhanced review and giving our agencies those tools to say, here's one path, here's another. So we have standardized insurance review policies, invoice review policies starting in 2021. As we move forward into this administration, we had the creation of the Vendor Integrity Unit at MOX. As you see, that was directly referenced as one of the recommendations is to create something we have already created. And indeed gone beyond that with the Vendor Compliance Cabinet. In terms of timing, I know we've, in our time in government, seen a lot of groups and task forces and things like that that can come and go. With the Vendor Compliance Cabinet, we've put a real effort on making sure that it's going to be institutionally strong. It has its own charter. It has very distinct members that are required to do discrete actions. And it is also both an input and an output scenario. They're going to be producing policies, all of these things that I discussed before that are in the pipeline to be discussed at the meeting later today, but then also an input for agencies. So for DHS, the issues that come with our agencies having different portfolios, different programmatic needs, there needs to be that clearinghouse effect. So I think a lot of our effort has been to establish that VIU in MOX, which is able to be a little more in the weeds, the Vendor Compliance Cabinet, which includes procuring agencies, oversights, and to be a kind of input-output clearinghouse. And then now we're at the very exciting stage of having these concrete policies. So I referenced them previously, but we have the anti-nepotism policy, which is already effective, conflicts of interest and related party transactions, which are in the pipeline. And indeed, something we haven't spoken about, but is similar, the standard audited financial review, SAFER, which again, we talk about standardizing the very burdensome audit processes in our nonprofit providers. This is also with the Vendor Compliance Cabinet and due to be released in 2025. Vendors have already seen it. I'm sorry.
So those recommendations came from the 2021 report?
Well, I would say some of those do feed that way, but at the same time, I think, as I think the 2024 report shows very clearly, our desire to implement these issues comes from the issues that we see on the ground. As the commissioner said, a lot of these were flagged for DOI. So a lot of them have grown out of the 2021 report. But I think it's fair to say that for all of us here, these are important issues that have been going on for 20, 30, 40 years that long pre-exist the 2019
Yeah, I asked
report.
because you referenced that, that a lot of the recommendations had already been implemented. And so I question why would DOI recommend that you implement a policy that is already in existence unless it wasn't something that was already have been activated in some sense.
Well, Chair, I will certainly defer to DOI on that. I think we've certainly raised with DOI the fact that this is very, the majority, not all, but I believe the majority of the conduct that we're talking about in this report is very old. And so it relates to a period in which those policies were not in place. And indeed, it relates to some instances that were reported to DOI, and then as DHS or other entities, MOX or MORMIC, acted upon that. So throughout this process, I would say that I agree with you, but I think that what the report does reflect, I think recommendation 2 is fair in saying MOX has already created this VIU, and they should continue to do that. So we're very thankful for our partners at DOI and their work and their role, but certainly on our side, we've been proactively taking these steps long before the issuance of this report, and certainly DHS even before MOX is the one even more on the ground.
Okay. Has DHS reformed its conflicts of interest disclosure system for providers or developed any guidance around executive compensation?
So with respect to conflicts of interest, yes, absolutely. There's changes we've made and changes that we are continuing to make. So as we are approving specific contracts, we are looking at both provider disclosures, right? So they are required to tell us if there is any conflicts of interest related party organizations, but we are also not necessarily taking their word for them. We're doing LexisNexis checks so that we can, if somebody is trying to hide something from us, that we have an opportunity to do that. The conflict of interest forms are getting stored in the Passport document vault, and then we are working with MOX to roll out policies and procedures around that so it is more what we are doing becomes more transparent both to the vendor community and to our staff. So that is a work in progress. Executive compensation is a much more complicated topic. So we do not pay executive compensation directly. There is no DHS shelter contract where an executive director salary is a line in the contract. Instead, the way executive director salaries are paid is through the indirect rate that is included in the contract, right, which is used for overhead costs, including executive salaries. Indirect rates are set in one of two ways. It's either a de minimis 10% or it is a federally approved level, right? So whatever the relevant federal agency for that organization reviews the documentation, looks at audited financial statements, other documents, and says this is an appropriate overhead rate. If an organization has a federally approved overhead rate, we will generally accept that. MOX does do a review as well. So because we are not directly paying those salaries, right, they are not showing up as a line item in the budget, and furthermore, because most of our providers are doing business not just with DHS, DSS, but with many other city agencies, often state agencies, federal agencies, we're not in a position to make unilateral decisions based on executive compensation.
See, but I would argue that first of all, I mean, having worked in the nonprofit world, 10% indirect rate seems very minimal, but it does have an impact on the ability to program and to run things, because it's money that essentially could be going to programming that is not going to salary. However, if a provider is just contracting with DHS, right, then there should be a cap. And even when a provider is contracting with multiple agencies, I don't see how it would hurt that on the DHS end there's some language that stipulates that only a certain percentage of, that grant can be used for salary. I mean, because the truth is, and I get it. Listen, most nonprofit organizations work really hard to provide, good resources and housing for families that are, currently unhoused. But there are people, and I know this, and I know that a lot of my colleagues, would probably agree to this, that come to us like all of the time, just begging to build more and more shelters because it's become a lucrative business for them. And so in those cases, I think that, it does alarm me, right, that folks are getting paid $400,000, $500,000, whatever it is, $700,000 just to run these sites, these facilities. And so I get it. If they have multiple contracts, it becomes difficult, and they can pay themselves whatever they want. But on the DHS end, if those contracts, is there the ability to cap on the DHS end in those cases?
Well, because we aren't paying directly, right, there is no line item in the contract that says this is the executive director salary, right?
No, I'm not telling you that.
It is all coming out of that indirect rate. So, I'll ask Pedros to chime in. There were some attempts to regulate executive compensation at the state level that ran into legal challenges. So I hear where you are coming from. Absolutely. Yeah. It's definitely a place that is very challenging for us, but let me ask my colleagues to add on to that.
Yeah, just to further illustrate the complexity on this, in 2012, then Governor Cuomo did institute a cap on certain providers, statewide nonprofit providers. That cap was mired in litigation, and the Court of Appeals eventually stripped some of the substantive authority associated to that executive order. And our current governor, only a couple years ago, overturned that cap and removed it. So it does sort of illustrate the complexities. It's not such a cut and dry issue on having an executive cap.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is as you can tell, Chair, it's a complex issue that we don't have a direct tool on, but that doesn't mean we're going to stop focusing on it. And I think that's where we say, what can we do? We can address clear issues of inappropriate behavior, like the related party transactions, the conflicts of interest. Those things they're not literally executive compensation, but when we talk about the issues surrounding executive compensation, they're very similar. If someone's misusing our money, if someone is not using our money correctly and the way that we told them to in the contract and the way that they have to, then that's a responsibility issue, and that will absolutely become a contract issue, whether or not whatever the executive compensation is. And I would finally say I think it's very important. That indirect cost rate is so important, and we've spent the last few years really trying to improve not just the policy behind it, but the operation of it. So I think it's also, in order to effectively reach that, we'd have to go into the indirect cost rate. I think we're very conscious of again, balancing the idea of, can we mitigate the risk a different way, rather than going into what is already a process that's hard for these providers. They really need that indirect cost rate. So it's always that balancing.
I'd also just add one more thing, that the particularly egregious examples that were called out in the report were actually really related to related party transactions, that we have shut down and shut down well before the report was released.
Okay. All right. Did you want to ask something on that? Oh, okay. Has DHS put into place any policies as it pertains to reviews of expenditures submitted by providers to ensure that they comply with existing requirements and include all necessary information?
Yeah, absolutely. We take invoice review very seriously. So there are several different pathways for a provider that is not on enhanced review, so doing the has a strong track record of financial behavior. We start with a fairly light touch prepayment review, right? So we're looking at payroll records is what, and a few OTPS lines looking, it's very much prescribed in this citywide standard invoice review policy. The intent there is to be quick. Again, as I've said before, we have room for improvement on the quick, but that is the design behind this citywide standard invoice review procedure. We then follow that up with a more detailed post-payment review, so that to the extent that there are challenges, that we're catching them relatively quickly. For a provider who is on enhanced review, meaning they've had some level of financial challenge in the past, we're doing a more in-depth review before any dollars go out the door. We are also working to add, excuse me, a third level of review to that is across the board, but again, not before we make payments, but in very close to real time, an independent level of invoice review. So what I talked about, the standard practice that is happening largely in the DHS programs with a final level of oversight from our finance team. We are adding within the accountability office a secondary level of invoice review, so that we just have that many more sets of eyes on it. Again, that will happen post-payment, but very quickly post-payment. We're trying to hit that balance between accountability and the provider's need for prompt payment.
Okay. Well, in the 2024 report, DOI reported that compliance-related information is collected via passport, but that the provided questions lack questions about conflict of interest or are too limited. Is DHS working to fix this gap to ensure that better information is gathered?
So in general, across the 32 recommendations that were in the DOI report, 12 of them are DSS specific, the other 20 related to recommendations around citywide practice, including this one. So I will defer the citywide questions to Mox.
Absolutely. So I think, Chair, as part of the standardized audited financial report that's SAFER, that's coming out in 2025, we're looking exactly at what can be, again, using that tool as a way to get those quote-unquote disclosures. I do want to be clear, it can be, obviously, in disclosures when it comes to contracting has a very legal term as to the vendor disclosures you're required to do. That's not our only tool. We have pre-qualification, we have audits, we have various ways in order to get this information. So we're absolutely, that's something that we agreed with in the DOI report of enhancing that. So we're in progress of doing that. I think that SAFER process will be key to it.
Which cycle will SAFER be rolled out, and
it's estimated,
which quarter?
I don't have a quarter for you. As I say, there's literally a vendor compliance cabinet meeting this afternoon that I can certainly update you after that regarding updates on timelines.
Is this your first meeting?
No. They've had many meetings. They've had several meetings. There is a meeting that happens to be today where they are discussing two of the documents that I referenced before, the conflicts of interest policy and the related party transactions. But to be clear, those are documents that, again, I think the entire vendor community has seen, agencies have seen, that have been vetted throughout kind of the stakeholders as we've developed this. I think as the commissioner put well, all of these policies have to come out of our day-to-day experience with our vendors. So that input of coming in and saying, this is what we need, these are the tools we need to make the right decisions, and these are the issues we're seeing, and then being able to put that out. So these have been long-term processes that are coming to a conclusion. As I mentioned, the anti-nepotism policy came first, and we have, I would say, really 3 in the pipeline that will certainly be out in 2025, and I can follow up on an estimate on the quarter.
Thank you, I appreciate that. Does DHS have program officers or staff that is assigned to visit the providers on an, I don't know, maybe biannual basis to conduct some sort of like internal audit?
Absolutely. Field work is a really important part of what we do. So our general structure on the shelter operations side, we have a chief of shelter operations, associate and assistant commissioners reporting up to her, and then program administrators and program analysts that have a portfolio based by provider. Their job is to be out in the field and working with providers much more frequently than biannual. We want them out on a regular basis. In addition to that, we do on a biannual basis, or annual basis, excuse me, we are doing physical inspections. So that is a different set of people with the right technical expertise and working in conjunction with HPD and DOB and other technical agencies. So absolutely, we can't do our job from the office.
So question, did any of those individuals flag some of the cases that you referenced in your testimony, those cases where contracts had to be removed or stripped from an organization? Did those actions be, were those prior to the DOI investigations?
Yep, absolutely. So, I mean, one of the most egregious cases that we've had, certainly in my tenure at DSS, DHS, is the CCS situation, right? They were a very large provider, and the first identification of issues came from the program administrator who was signing off on invoices, who said, hey, something is wrong, is here. They raised that up the food chain, as they should. We made the referral to DOI, and we ended operations with them. This was actually pre-COVID, so this was, although there is quite a number of mentions of CCS in the report, that was something that we've closed out business with them many years ago. But, that sort of multi-pronged approach to provider oversight that starts with the staff who are in the field, who are working with providers on a day-to-day basis. They are absolutely a critical part of this, and we are very grateful for the work that frontline staff does every day.
Okay. All right. I appreciate that. Thank you.
I'm going to turn over to Councilmember Brandon. I just want to say on the salary issue, because it comes up a lot, I think what least would be helpful would be to break down for the public, like many times they're saying, okay, the private sector is paying for X, and so leave me alone, don't bother me, and I understand this legal issue, but I think we should continue the discussion because it is outrageous to have those really high salaries and then people getting paid staff so much less. And the public doesn't understand it. So I think it's something to continue. I understand the legal issues, but I would love to have more discussion about that.
We're happy to continue the discussion.
Councilmember Brandon.
Thank you, Chairs. Continuing on that point, DOI recommended that DHS divide contract oversight. Actually, no, I want to start here. In Section 602A of the standard contract, it requires the providers to disclose information about executive compensation, including funding resources at the time of contract execution. However, DOI found that at least 13 providers had not provided DHS with this information. So has DHS looked into this matter to determine how many providers had not disclosed executive compensation?
Yeah, we've absolutely strengthened our disclosures across the board, executive compensation and otherwise, so that is a much tighter part of the contracting process, something that we're looking at as we're doing responsibility determinations, as we are registering any given contract. As I mentioned, any questionnaires on conflict of interest reports, all of that documentation is getting stored in the document vault within Passport, so that we can do follow-up if there are issues identified.
And do you have an idea of how many providers use city funds for executive compensation?
So as I discussed, we pay the indirect rate that is used globally for oversight, overhead expenses. So we don't get, by definition, we don't get a breakdown of how the indirect rate is spent. So no, I can't answer that.
Would it be helpful to know how that indirect rate is spent?
I mean, really, by definition, it is intended for overhead and for a range of different costs. Anything that isn't eligible for direct charge to a contract. And I think it is going to vary, frankly, by a provider, year-by-year basis, right? An organization that has, a particular cost in a given year, they may change how they're using their overhead. There is a perpetual balance, and I think this ties also to what we were talking about with the need to balance the level of review with the pace of invoice payment. Operating an organization is challenging, right? Situations happen. Organizations need some level of flexibility to be able to run and to be nimble and to adjust on a day-to-day basis. That level has to be reasonable. I think looking at indirect rates and making sure we have really clear policies on what is and isn't okay as an indirect rate, what kind of approval has to be there, but also recognizing that to the extent that if we are signing off on every literal dollar that the not-for-profit spends, that we are actually harming their ability to operate. So we're perpetually seeking that balance. If there are thoughts, recommendations that you have on how we manage that balance of continuing to have our partners operate in a way that is that gives them the flexibility that they need while also getting to the appropriate financial accountability. We aren't set in stone. I think one of the things that you can certainly see in all of our testimony is that from 2001, when the DOI report started, to where we sit today at the end of 2021 to end of 2024, we've made a lot of changes and we have more changes in process. So I'm certainly not saying that anything is set in stone, but I think doing away with the indirect rate or requiring line item sign-off in the indirect rate would create a lot of challenges for our not-for-profit partners.
And does DHS, do you have an idea of how much DHS spent in FY24 in executive compensation?
No, because we don't pay executive compensation directly. It is, we pay indirect rates, and then within the indirect rate, that is, pieces of that is used on executive compensation.
Okay, what I was starting on before, DOI recommended that DHS divide contract oversight responsibilities between employees who specialize in fiscal management and employees who specialize in program management. DHS indicated that it agrees with this recommendation, but is unable to implement it due to citywide hiring constraints. So could you tell us how many additional personnel would you need to hire to implement DOI's recommendation?
Yeah. So this is something that we're looking at really closely right now. I think the reason it has been structured the way it has been in the past is that there was really a feeling that having staff who know what's going on the ground, who can say, you invoiced for 5 caseworkers, but when I was there last week, there were only 4, right? Like that it's actually useful to have that level of intimacy with a provider's records. I think it also creates other challenges, both in the pace of review, because people have dual responsibility for both the programmatic work and the invoice review, and then some of the concerns that DOI raised on separation of duties. So it's something that we're actively working on right now, looking at what the best options are. I think it would be premature to say where we are landing on what the program model should be and then the staffing model that we'll need to talk about with OMB, but OMB has been a good partner working with us on the need to balance accountability and pace of review. Very grateful to them that we've been able to get sign off to do some hiring on filling existing vacancies, but doing some hiring outside the allocation process that is limiting most of our hiring, so that that does get to both contracting and invoice review, so that we are able to increase both our accountability and our pace.
Have you discussed with OMB specifically around the hiring that would be needed to comply with DOI's recommendations?
Not yet, because we're still designing what we think the optimal program model looks like.
Okay, DOI found that compliance and oversight functions are currently split between the Office of Agency Chief Contracting Officer and the Office of Accountability, and that employees in DHS's program division are responsible for reviewing provider invoices. So could you tell us, what were the budgets for the Office of Agency Chief Contracting Officer and the Office of Accountability in 24, and what are they in 25?
We'll have to follow up with those specific numbers. I'm sorry we got those questions relatively late, but we'll happy to follow up.
Okay, you'll get them to me by when?
As quickly as possible.
Okay. With regard to the Cherokee Nation Management and Consulting contract with New York City Health and Hospitals, were there any breaches of procurement laws or ethical guidelines identified in the handling of the migrant shelter contracts? And if so, what corrective actions have been implemented?
So I'm sorry, I can't speak to H&H contracting procedures specifically. I can tell you Cherokee Nation has an emergency contract with DHS as well. They are operating one of our emergency sites. We have our approach to the emergency contracting, which applied to Cherokee as well as to anybody else that we are working with, is that we had an emergency RFP that so although it was done, we did use emergency contracting procedures. There was a competitive process that we followed very closely and are went through all of the registration processes that apply to emergency contracts. We did need to move very quickly. We had a very dramatic increase in our shelter census in a fairly short period of time, but by using this emergency RFP, we were able to maintain a competitive process while also balancing the need for speed.
Okay, I guess just to zoom out, given the allegations of misconduct of various folks in the administration and various resignations amid federal investigations, what steps are you taking to review and possibly reform the processes that particularly concerning the migrant shelter contracts?
So, DSS follows procurement policies very closely. We stick to the letter of those rules, and City Hall personnel are not directly involved in any of our contracting actions. So when we were faced with the rapid increase in the shelter census, we worked with the Comptroller's Office following the guidelines for emergency procurement, but also really looking to maintain competitiveness. So that RFP existed independently of any of the structure at City Hall, that we were able to follow competitive procurement guidelines, doing it in a way that was quick, that we were able to meet our legal obligations to shelter everybody. But I am confident that we followed as I say, the letter of the procurement regulations, and that we are on the thoroughly adhering to all of our accountability requirements there.
So are there any new policies or oversight mechanisms that have been introduced to prevent contract interference going forward?
Specifically from City Hall, that is our procurement has been independent of City Hall from the beginning. We have open for any shelter, whether it's emergency or non-emergency site, we have an existing open-ended RFP. Providers apply. There is then an independent committee of agency staff that reviews that RFP for compliance with reviews that proposal with compliance with the RFP terms. that is insulated not only from City Hall, but from me. I am not involved in that process. If the committee finds that proposal meets those threshold criteria, there is, in accordance with procurement policies, there's a award letter issued that is a license to negotiate a contract. It is not in and of itself a contract. As we go through the negotiation process, that big part of that obviously is budget. Every shelter budget is reviewed by the Office of Management and Budget. We don't move forward without OMB sign off. And then once we do have agreed upon budget, the contract itself is reviewed by OMB, MOX, Law Department before ultimately going through the Controller's Office. So, I am confident that following that structure and following the letter of the procurement rules provides adequate insulation from politics.
How long does it typically take OMB to sign off for a payment?
So OMB is not reviewing individual payments. That is happening at the agency level. OMB reviews both first initial budgets for a shelter and then ultimately the contracts.
So how long does it take them to sign off for a budget or a contract?
Again, that is something that depends.
Weeks, days, months?
It depends a lot on what time of year we're in, right? When we are in the peak of budget season, when they're in the middle of doing a plan, it'll take a little bit longer. When we're not in plan cycle, it goes faster. What we did several years ago, this was probably about 2020, we negotiated what we call our model budget templates with OMB. A standard budget framework for each type of shelter, right? Something different for families with children, for employment shelter, for single adults, different structures. A budget that adheres very closely to that model budget will go faster to the extent that there is something specific about that site that requires a little bit more boutique analysis. That takes a longer period of time.
Because what some of us are seeing is that it seems that OMB or DHS is approving payments for contracts much quicker than anywhere else. I mean, I have housing developers who are now engaging in shelter contracts purely, and they've never done this before, but they're doing this basically because they're telling me DHS pays them quicker than HPD does.
So what I think is happening here, and I'm interpreting a little bit, so in terms of shelter versus housing development, and let me start by saying this is an and, not an or. We as a city desperately need affordable housing, and I want to thank the City Council for the City of Yes vote last week. I think that is incredibly important. But we are also in a city with literally 1 million low-income rent-burdened households. So for the time being, we are also going to need shelter. In New York City, virtually all new housing construction depends on the availability of federal low-income housing tax credits. This is a finite resource. I won't go too far down the rabbit hole, and I'm speaking in my former HPD hat rather than my current seat, but those are a scarce resource as allocated by the federal government, but they provide a really critical source of equity for affordable housing development. Because those are finite, there is a pipeline between, how long when you are going to get into the queue for a low-income housing tax credit allocation. Financing for shelter development looks different, so that queue and the amount of time that it takes to do development and how long a site might be.
What's your budget right now for new shelter development?
It's not broken out exactly that way. The total DHS budget, because of the rapid growth in the census, is about $4 billion.
That's your total budget?
That's our total budget.
And you can't speculate how much of that is earmarked for new shelter development, retrofitting, or soup to nuts building?
No, because it's all folded into the single adult budget, the families with children budget. When we actually incur expenses depends on the development timeline. The nature of right to shelter means that we adjust constantly the amount of shelter capacity that we have relative to the need for shelter. So it's just simply not broken out that way.
Yeah, I mean, the situation I'm thinking of in my district is I've got a vacant lot, which is a unicorn in southern Brooklyn, where I'd love to build affordable low-income housing, or any kind of housing. And the developer is in contract to build a shelter that's going to take 2-3 years to build. And the reason why is because they're saying because they can get paid quicker from DHS and HPD, they'd love to build housing. So it's a different dynamic of retrofitting a building where you're talking months versus right now it's just a vacant lot that it could be housing to house folks, but it's going to be a shelter.
So again, I think it is incredibly important that we are citywide talking about shelter and housing. And we are also very committed, as you and I have
But we
talked
want
about.
people in shelter to ultimately end up in housing.
Absolutely. That's a huge priority for us. Last year, we moved 18,500 households out of shelter into permanent housing as a record for us. So we think about permanent housing all the time. But making sure that we do have an adequate and appropriate and well-managed and maintained shelter footprint that can accommodate need is important, right? The analogy that I use is that shelter is the emergency room of the housing sector, right? We don't want anybody to be getting their primary care for the emergency room, and we don't want anybody to be living in the shelter system long term. But while people are facing emergencies, and right now we have an awful lot of low-income, rent-burdened households, we do need an adequate emergency room. The difference between the HPD pipeline and the DHS pipeline, I think, does really relate to that low-income housing tax credit
I just think that the word emergency is being used a lot, and when you're talking about building something that's 2 or 3 years away, 2 or 3 years is not an emergency.
It is the emergency that I am talking about in that case is the emergency of that household, right? Homelessness exists in New York City as a function of, decades of growth in income inequality, decades and decades of underinvestment in affordable housing in general, long-term policies around wage growth.
I don't disagree.
Right?
We're on the same page. I just think what's happening here is these developers, they'll build whatever. They're agnostic. They're building shelters simply because DHS is paying them quicker than HPD. They're in the business of building housing, but they're building shelter for this reason. They're not building shelter for any other policy reason.
So I guess the point that I am trying to make is that it is, as much as we need housing, it is not a problem to also build shelter because we need a robust shelter sector. Not only is it our legal obligation, I frankly think it's a moral obligation, right? I grew up in California. I go back to visit family, and on every highway off-ramp, there is a tent. It's frankly horrifying that in some of the most expensive real estate in the city, that you have mass unsheltered homelessness. In New York City, 95% of the people experiencing homelessness are sheltered. Is the goal permanent housing? Absolutely. Is the need for shelter going to continue to exist for the foreseeable future because of all of those macroeconomic factors that I talked about? Unfortunately, yes.
Does DHS have any contract with DocGo?
Not at this time. We did during COVID.
And who do you have now? You have Garner?
No, all of our emergency sites are operated by not-for-profit organizations.
Okay. Okay, Chair, thank you.
Thank you very much. We've been joined by Council Members Joseph and Stevens, and now Council Member Wan.
Thank you so much. I think there's a clear pattern of questioning here about our executive compensation as well as conflict of interest. So I want to go back to the conflict of interest. For example, Victor Rivera, former CEO of Bronx Parent Housing Network, he made $250 million, $274 million to be exact, in which he was also arrested He was arrested after the investigation, but in addition to misuse of city funds, he was accused for sexual harassment from 10 women, including homeless women, as well as his own employees, and he enriched himself through the nonprofit. So it's clear that currently the self-reporting of the disclosure forms, conflict of disclosure forms, are not working. So can you help us understand specifically what you've added to the disclosure forms? And you talked a little bit about LexisNexis. I think that's a great step. Was that already being done? What happened in cases like this where there were a lot of gaps where people were just going through unscathed for so many years?
Yeah, the Bronx parent case is a horrific one, and my heart goes out to all of the people who, both the clients and the staff who are affected by that. That is an example of an incident where DHS took aggressive action. Our goal is always to get a not-for-profit to a place where they can succeed, but if they can't, to end business with them. In that instance, working in conjunction with DOI, we essentially took over the organization. So leadership was exited from the organization. There was a monitor that was appointed, and at this point, the organization is functioning as with a completely different both board and leadership structure. I think our goal always with the not-for-profit organizations, right, is to support capacity and community-based organizations when we can, and to make aggressive action and changes where we can't. So that was an unusual circumstance where we were able to actually really completely overhaul leadership. It was that incident that triggered the DOI report. So a lot of the changes that we have made since then, since 2021, weren't in place then, are in place now, right? So the level of conflict of interest forms that we're doing, that independent checking using LexisNexis, a lot of this is work that has evolved over the last several years, right? We didn't wait for the DOI report to come out. We have been making aggressive changes all along.
Can you be a little bit more specific? Because this scheme for this case for Victor Rivera lasted from 2013 to 2020. That is a very long time. So I'm glad that we've made steps to make changes. So can you be more specific? What changes have been made to the COIB report?
So let me talk specifically about subcontracts, because I think that is what it is that we're really getting at.
And related party transactions.
Yeah, so subcontracts and particularly related party subcontracts. So for the last several years, what we have been doing is that anytime we are approving a contract, right, any contract that we are looking at, and frankly, any budget that we are looking at, so even if the contract is up and running, but we do an annual budget approval, we are looking at those subs. This is a process that has been known as the 65A approval after the form that providers had to fill out. We have it's citywide, but I think DHS, DSS have taken a very aggressive approach to that over the last several years, really digging into how are those subcontracts procured, and is there any indication of related party transaction there. So even if there's no indication of related party transaction, but if we are not seeing 3 bids, we will not approve that subcontract. So what that means from a payment perspective is that we will hold on that subcontractor payment, pay the rest of the invoice. So for example, provider invoices for the month of November, it includes a security subcontract. If they don't have that 65A, that subcontractor approval, we will pay on the rest of the contract. We will hold on the security portion of the invoice. I actually suspect probably many of you have heard from providers complaining about our 65A approval process, because it does take time to do that level of review. One of the things that I'm really encouraged about for going forward is that has been built into the latest iteration of Passport. So I think that is going to allow us to be both more accountable and quicker.
Could you also expand, so in one instance, Subco, which has roughly $35 million in city shelter contracts, subcontracted for a for-profit security company that it wholly owns.
So just to clarify, we're no longer doing business with Subco, and I know they have other contracts with the city. I don't believe we ever hit anything close to, they were a relatively small shelter provider, but I can double check the numbers. Yes, the reason
So, just to finish, this allowed the senior leadership at Subco, who also serve as a director and deputy director of the security company, to collect hundreds and thousands of dollars in payments for the for-profit funded through the nonprofit city contract. So can you help us understand, especially from Mox, because even if DHS no longer does business with Subco, it seems that they're still doing business with the city. So what can Mox do to ensure that vendors like Subco are engaging in a competitive bidding process and not just giving business to their own companies owned by their own leadership?
Absolutely, Chair One. So in particular, regarding, touching on your kind of last issue of DHS perhaps not doing business with an entity or other agencies doing, I have to say I have no personal knowledge of the contractor you described doing business with anybody else. I can follow up. But it is, I think, important, and as we've discussed before, to note that vendor responsibility and that determination that a vendor is responsible for receipt of public funds is by law on a case-by-case basis. The city does not have the tools at its disposal to blacklist or otherwise a vendor. We do not have those tools. The state has some tools to do that we can take notice of. The federal government has aspects they can do that we can take notice of. But when it comes to, as you say, a vendor who may have had an integrity problem or even performance that was not adequate or anything else, it's going to be a case-by-case determination for each agency when it comes before them, and that is determined by law that the city will take it on a case-by-case basis. So you mentioned in particular the related party transactions. As I referenced earlier, this is a significant issue and one that Mox has been working since the start of the administration to try and make a better reality. So I mentioned we have our related party transactions policy and procedure that has been vetted with members of the vendor community, that's been vetted with stakeholders, with procuring agencies, with oversights to make sure it's effective. That is, and I do want to emphasize, we're purposely being very rigorous in developing these things. The last thing we want to do is set out a policy that will make it harder for the vast majority of good acting nonprofit providers to do their day-to-day job. So those are going through the process of the VCC, and we hope, as I said, to have those out in 2025. So in particular, regarding related party transactions, the city has, for the first time in, I think, a very long time, been able to enhance, and we're looking to have that out in 2025.
Councilmember, I want to correct my statement on the record. I'm sorry, we do still have 2 contracts with Subco. Apologies, I got them mixed up with a different vendor. But what we are doing when we have identified a related party transaction is sort of one of 2 pathways. In some cases, we've ended business with the vendor entirely. That was the case with Core, which is another one that was called out in the report. Or we have taken very aggressive action to ensure that they are no longer allowed to use their related sub-entity.
The security company in question, Century Security, received more than $11.6 million for security services over a 4-year period. The owners of the company were listed publicly on the website of both the nonprofit and the subcontractor for the security company. I know that Chair Brewer was referring to AI. There are systems that are automated to scrub the web or scrape it for you so that you don't run into problems like this. Can you help me understand what we're doing now to ensure that potential instances of double dipping like this is not happening any longer?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, council member. So the process would be that when we are either entering into a new contract or approving the annual budget for an existing contractor, that we look at their subcontracts, right? So typical subcontracts, for example, are security, sometimes maintenance. We start with how was their procurement process done, right? So can they provide evidence of 3 bids? If they can't provide evidence of 3 bids, that's a hard line. We'll go back. We'll say, we need to see the bids. Once they do have the bids, we're going to look at them to make sure that those are in fact independent bids and that they are going with the lowest responsible bidder. If they cannot provide documentation of that, that they have appropriately followed the procurement process, we can't make payment on the portion of the invoice that is related to that subcontract. In addition to that, we are asking for conflict of interest disclosures, again, at the point of contracting, and doing searches, LexisNexis, but, to your point, certainly online more generally, to identify any related party actions. This is something that we have gotten much more stringent on in recent times.
What are the rest of the city agencies doing to avoid this from happening?
So, Chair, in terms of the commissioner just referenced some of those kind of Lexis review checks, those different things using the internet. Those are all a required part of the responsibility determination. So at the point of which an award is going to be given, agencies are required to proactively affirm that a potential awardee is going to be responsible. That's not just, responsibility can mean a lot of things. I think in particular for our discussion, we're talking a lot about financial or fiscal responsibility. Do they have the procedures in place to make sure they're going to spend the city's money wisely? Of course, to a certain extent, you're not going to be able to know till they do the job. But the goal of the responsibility determination is to be able to predict it.
But you could also just Google them and see that they're running books.
So exactly as I said, Chair, they do Google them, and they do use those resources available to them. They're reviewing their performance evaluations and their disclosures if they reach the threshold where they need to give disclosures. So at various levels, that's the standard process, but I think as the Commissioner has well put, based off of the evidence that we've seen, based off of the issues that we've seen, some of which ended up in the DOI report, there's a special emphasis that DHS takes to be best in class. There's no doubt about it when it comes to making sure, looking at subcontractor approvals, DHS is best in class, and I think it's not only a reflection of their professionalism, but because they understand the issues in their portfolio and the issues that they have to address. So agencies will do it a different way. As you know, and as I said with the vendor compliance cabinet, a key goal is seeing where can we standardize that is program appropriate. Obviously, reviewing a nonprofit is different than reviewing a construction company, but there's a way to meet in the middle. So we're absolutely looking for those goals across the board, but there will be a difference, and I would give credit to DHS. I think certainly really we're talking about since that timeline, since 2020, you reference of really stepping up and having best in class that is now informing citywide best practices that are being rolled out.
I have a lot of concern for DHS, for CAMBA, SEPCO, Bronx Parent Housing Network. These have been identified partners to be bad faith actors. So in 2024, DOI's report noted that DHS currently relies heavily on only 17 providers who comprise 65% of the city's shelter capacity. We've heard from providers in other forums that delayed payments and other contracting requirements make it difficult for smaller providers to bid for these contracts. What is the contingency plan, if any, for unexpected one of these large providers to end their relationship with DHS or is otherwise unable to perform, like going to jail? Or can DSS share if it has any other plans to ease the proposal process or provide support for smaller providers to allow them to deliver DSS services?
Thank you, Councilmember. It's really important to us that we are both getting experienced providers in the door while also opening up opportunity for others. So we, I talked earlier about our open-ended RFP process. We really encourage a range of providers to come in. One of the things that we are looking at is capacity as we are reviewing providers. That can mean one of two things, right? It means, do you have the experience necessary to do the job, both compliance with city procedures and as well as actually providing shelter services? Both of those are complicated, as we have been talking about. So we want to make sure that we have somebody who has some level of relevant experience. If they are not a previous DHS shelter provider, we're looking at, have they operated shelter in another jurisdiction, or do they have experience with other city human services contracts that would be relevant? And then for those who are existing DHS providers, one of the things that we're looking at is bandwidth, right? Sometimes we're going to say, now's not the right time. We have concerns about your capacity here, not as a pejorative thing, but just, it's hard to run an organization. We recognize that. One of the things that I would say is an upside of the recent growth in the shelter census, not a place where I generally look for upsides, but we have added, I think, close to a dozen new providers over the last couple of years, and I think that's exciting for us. It's capacity that we can grow over time. With respect to your questions around contingency planning, right, our goal always is, if we detect a problem, to work with the organization to try and rectify it. That is step one. We've also really demonstrated that nobody is too big to fail. I talked earlier about CCS. They were a really major provider. And their issues were too egregious. They were not savable. And we ended our relationship with them. They are not the only one. So we will take action, and we take rapid action when we need to. But we also are looking at technical assistance. In addition, we have, pulling up my numbers here, I believe it is 11 providers on what we call capacity building agreements. So these are smaller not-for-profits newer to the DHS system, where we have actually put structured plans in place to help them grow and to figure out how to comply with, as we've been discussing for the last several hours, what are sometimes very complex city requirements.
Thank you. Can you just expand on what you have to do that is under egregious for them to be terminated from a city contract? Because some of the things that we've seen in the news are pretty egregious, but they continue to do work with the city. So what are those requirements to be terminated from a city contract?
Well, I mean, we absolutely look at cases on a situational basis, but our toolbox is robust. Ending a city contract is one of them, but I talked about with Bronx Parent, right? The organization still exists, but the leadership, both board and executive, are completely different because we were the ones driving that organizational change. There's also, we use corrective action plans, which are very structured initiatives to drive change within an organization. What that looks like will depend on whatever the circumstances are. We use the enhanced review process where we're changing the way we're doing invoice review. We have at least one instance that I can think of where we are working with the DOI where there is a monitor in place. But one of the things that we recognize is that CBOs in many cases have very deep histories within their communities. They come from a place with community connection, with history, with skill sets. We don't want to write that off too easily. We want to our goal is to get to people to succeed, both with respect to financial accountability and quality of services. So while, yes, we will end relationship with a provider where it is the appropriate thing to do, we try to course correct wherever possible.
I want to shift gears to talk about executive compensation, as many of my colleagues have brought up. The DOI report pointed to 5 nonprofits where executives rake them more than $700,000 annually, and another 8 where executives earn more than $500,000. The report flagged 2 such nonprofits in striking executive pay: CAMBA, CAMBA Incorporated, where President Joanne Opolstel earned more than $750,000 in fiscal year 22, and Acacia Network, where President Raul Rusi took in $935,391 that fiscal year, almost $1 million. And these providers also have shelters in my district currently. A spokesperson for Acacia referred to the nonprofit's response in a footnote of the DOI report, which stated that its executive salaries were based on combined revenue, budget, and assets, like we discussed, and noted that third-party consultants and found its pay meets the standard of reasonableness established by the IRS. So my question is, were the salaries at CAMBA and Acacia Network flagged as excessive during any audits or evaluations by DHS? If not, why? And how does MOX coordinate with IRS to verify that nonprofits are adhering to the standards of, quote, reasonableness for executive pay?
Thank you, Councilmember. As I've discussed, we are not directly paying, and therefore, executive compensation, right, is not paid directly through our contracts. We are paying an indirect cost rate that not-for-profits then use to pay for a variety of overhead costs, including executive compensation. So the short answer is no, we were not signing off on those figures. I've certainly heard loud and clear the concerns raised here around executive compensation. As we've discussed, it's a complicated landscape, both with respect to what DSS can do unilaterally within the larger infrastructure of city agencies, and then also within the legal structure that has happened before. But it is something that we are happy to continue conversations both with MOX and with the council to figure out what is viable. But I'll allow MOX to chime in.
Yes, absolutely. So as part of the what used to be called the Vendex process and now is housed in Passport with vendor integrity. One service that Mox provides is kind of being a central clearinghouse for various types of information. So in that regard, certainly your IRS tax forms, your state required charitable forms, these are all aspects, and I think the Commissioner mentioned before, things like Document Vault and Passport are all meant to be able to bring those together and provide a faster review. In terms of reasonableness, as the Commissioner said, we do not directly approve or disapprove of any executive director or kind of leader of a nonprofit salary. That's not the insight we have into those costs because we don't pay those costs. I think, as you've said, Chair, and I think most of the council here has said today, and as we've said, it's clearly an issue that we are curious about and need to find a way to make sure we're getting the best value for the city. And we've tried to address that with the tools that we do have, such as related party transactions, conflicts of interest, anti-nepotism. However, we do need to be mindful of the wider regulatory landscape. And I would also highlight, Chair, you asked before about building the portfolio of providers here. And as you know, we usually have larger portfolios. But the DHS portfolio and sheltering is a very difficult job, even compared to the other things the city asks to do. So it is also important to note, the idea of we're always mindful of potentially limiting competition and sticking to the key criteria, which is delivering value to the city for what we are contracting for, whereas dictating exterior measures that are not directly there and that are not maybe immediately in our tool chest is going to be a lot less effective and end up limiting that pool of potential vendors even more. We think we can mitigate that same risk more effectively through those other directives that I've mentioned. But finally, I would note these issues are absolutely still under active consideration by all stakeholders, including the vendor compliance cabinet. So there's no period at the end of that of this. We're continuing to look at every way that we can do to get the best value for the city.
Okay, so if I'm hearing correctly, for executive compensation, there are no guidelines or benchmarks used by DHS or MOX to determine reasonableness for executive compensation. And can you help me understand how frequently does MOX review nonprofit executive salaries, if at all, and what steps are taken to ensure that there's compliance with public funding requirements?
So I'll take the first one. I would say I would disagree with your characterization regarding MOX not checking reasonableness. As I think you just said, the IRS clearly has a level of reasonableness that people are then interpreting against. To be very clear, MOX is not put in a position at any point to be proclaiming on the reasonableness of that executive salary.
So you don't provide any further guidance on reasonableness?
In particular, I think as the Commissioner said, because that is not something that the city directly pays. So there would be nothing to therefore issue guidance on. Regarding a different paradigm in which the city does do so, as I've said, we would be very interested in continuing the discussions about how to effectively do that. But to be very clear, again, I think, Chair, there is not something that is not being done. It is not a tool in our tool chest. It's not one of our costs that we pay. It's through that indirect rate, and we absolutely recognize the issue and would definitely value further conversations on how you think we can best address the negative outcomes. But yes, to reiterate what the Commissioner said, that is not a line item that we are paying out, and it's just a little bit different than the line item.
Okay, since it's indirect, it's safe for me to say that you don't review nonprofit executive salaries then for compliance issues?
MOX does not directly review that for any compliance issues.
Or neither does the agency?
We don't pay it, and that very much correct. We don't pay it, so there isn't a review policy.
Thank you. And does MOX evaluate, or does the agency evaluate any methodologies or conclusions that third-party hired nonprofits use to justify executive pay?
Once again, we do not review or approve any executive salary for a city nonprofit. It's not a line item in our contracts.
Okay, because the DOI report does recommend that DHS to develop more specific guidance for agencies on executive compensation and consider setting a cap and other parameters on city-funded executive compensation. So I look forward to continuing to have this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I call on Zoom, Councilmember Brooks Powers, I want to welcome Holy Cross High School, who exist in Councilmember Palladino's district. Welcome very much. Nice to have you here. And I also want to welcome Council Members Rivera, Riley, and Krishnan. And now go ahead online, Councilmember Brooks Powers, with your question.
Thank you so much, Chair, and thank you to the agency for their testimony today. Just a couple of questions. I wanted to, know what specific reforms are being implemented to ensure greater accountability in shelter contracts, particularly in addressing excessive executive salaries and conflicts of interest. And I apologize if this was asked. I had to step away for another commitment. And then also, how does the city currently monitor nepotism and conflicts of interest among shelter operators? What additional safeguards can be put in place to ensure fair hiring practices? And then, given the projected $10 billion expenditure in sheltering over the next 3 years, what strategies are in place to optimize spending and maximizing the quality of service for asylum seekers and the unhoused? I know, as you know, Commissioner, in my district, we have some challenges with a migrant shelter in Far Rockaway, 2 of them that we've met about, and we're looking to see what that transition out of that shelter looks like, but wanting to know with such a large anticipated expenditure on sheltering over the next 3 years, what is the strategy? What is the plan?
Thank you, Council Member. I was taking notes. Hopefully, I got all the questions. You'll correct me if I don't. So let me start first with conflict of interest and nepotism. So these are 2 places where we have taken aggressive action over the last several years to change how we are doing business. With respect to conflict of interest, there are very clear disclosure forms that providers have to submit. We are also doing checks on vendors, subcontracts, to make sure that there are no related party entities. That includes not only review of those disclosure forms, but also LexisNexis searches, internet searches, as Councilmember Wan suggested, right? So that we are following, really digging in to make sure that we are identifying any of those conflicts of interest. That is our standard practice now, and DSS is working with MOX on what will be a policy so that it is even more transparent, both for our vendor community and for staff. On nepotism, and a point that I made earlier, I'm not sure if you were available to hear it, is, nepotism is one of those things that it's a broad term that can encompass things that are deeply problematic, as well as things, 2 relatives forming an organization together that's actually, something that maybe we want to celebrate as opposed to penalize. So we have created a policy. It started at DSS. It then became the guidelines for the citywide policy to really do that case-by-case assessment to understand whether or not relationships between staff people are problematic or not. So if there is a relationship between staff people at an organization, they can apply for a waiver. That waiver goes first to MOX, then to the agency, and we can opt to approve it or disapprove it, put guardrails in place, things like that. So then with respect to executive compensation, because we as an agency do not pay executive compensation directly, that's paid through the agency's overhead rate, either a de minimis 10% or the level that is approved by the federal government as their indirect rate. Our ability to manage that, to control that is essentially non-existent. We've heard very loud and clear the council's concerns about executive compensation. Our as my colleague said, our toolbox is quite limited there, but we've heard the concern and are happy to continue to have conversations about that. With respect to shelter spending and accountability there over time, I think the first thing that we should be doing as we think about shelter spending is trying to reduce the size of the shelter census. It's not something that's going to happen overnight, but it is something that I am really deeply committed to. We've been incredibly focused on shelter exits to permanent housing over the last couple of years. That's a long-term focus, but one that we've ratcheted up since I've been in this seat. Last year, we had about 18,500 exits from shelter into permanent housing, which it's a record-breaking number and something that I'm really proud of all of the work that the team did. Shelter is an important safety net for people in an emergency situation, but it is not the goal for anybody long-term. And I think going into calendar year 2025, one of the things that is going to be a priority for me and the agency Does that mean I should stop talking? For me and the agency is to make sure that in addition to this focus on exits, we have to maintain that, but we also need to be thinking about how we can do better upstream prevention and how we can focus on our diversion work. So that's something that we're going to be looking at. That being said, I do believe we're going to continue to need a shelter system for the foreseeable future, and that it should be a strong and accountable shelter system. We do live in a city with a very low vacancy rate and a very high number of rent-burdened households. So that people will continue to face emergencies. I see accountability and both financial and programmatic as something that needs to underpin everything that the agency does, starting with the staff who are out in the field on a regular basis, who are interacting with the provider staff, who are tracking performance metrics like the number of exits to permanent housing, with our technical staff who do site inspections, then including our Office of Accountability. I'm joined here by our Chief Accountability Officer. They're doing third-party audits. They're monitoring incident data. They are running our agency vendor management committee, a host of other functions. And then the third leg of that stool is our ACO's office, making sure that the contracting process itself is done in accordance with the PPB rules and that organizations' responsibility determinations are adequate. So it is something that is incredibly important to us. It is an iterative process that we continue to build on, but it is important to us that we are providing services that meet the needs not only of our clients but our community and to the extent that there are issues, I will be the first to acknowledge that we can always improve on what we are doing. We're always happy to engage and to look at individual case problem solving.
Commissioner, I think we could agree like $10 billion is nothing to sneeze at. That's a significant amount of dollars that we're talking about. And just in terms of what I've seen firsthand in terms of the lack of oversight and accountability for the agency providers in the shelters that are overseeing the migrant population in my district, I'm still not clear on what the strategies that are in place to optimize the spending and maximize the quality of services are going to be versus what we're seeing today. Like, what is the shift going to be? What is the difference going to be?
So, as you know, as I think everybody knows, the number of shelter clients grew very substantially in a very short period of time. And we opened a large number of sites very, very quickly. We did that to meet both our legal and moral obligation to make sure that we are sheltering all of those in need. For quite a while, many of those emergency sites were operated not by not-for-profit providers, but actually by the National Guard and a series of temp staff. We did that because we were in an emergency condition, but that was very challenging, right? I am incredibly grateful for the National Guard service, but those are not trained shelter operators, and they didn't have all the levels of structure that we need. As of this fall, we have not-for-profits in every single site, and we are now in a place where we can put our structure around oversight and engagement and training in place with those not-for-profits. So again, we are always looking to improve on what we are doing. I'm never going to sit in front of the council and say that we do everything perfectly. At the beginning of this hearing, Councilmember Brewer noted that I often say no.
She does.
That is the case, but I also commit that I will always be honest. And what I can say honestly is that we are an organization that is seeking continual improvement. So I think the fact that we now have not-for-profit providers in place in every single one of our emergency sites is an important inflection point, and we will continue to build on the work that we are doing, and we're happy to do that in consultation with council members.
My last question, I thank you, chairs, for allowing me this opportunity. My last question is, with the administration beginning to scale back the shelters, because I guess the numbers of the migrants have begun to decline in terms of who's in the care of the city. I'd like to know what phase will the shelter on Beach 21st and the shelter in Edgemere be in terms of being phased out? Now that communities are being prioritized, considering that my district, I think probably second to Councilmember Wands, is like one of the most saturated with shelters in general. And so wanting to know what that plan of action is, and if the $10 billion you have is going to go towards beginning to connect migrants to necessary services and transitioning them out of shelter. And that's where I'll end at with this. Thank you, chairs.
So let me start with the last point. Absolutely connecting all clients, including migrants, to permanent housing and helping people exit shelter is a priority for the agency. For the most part, the asylum seekers are eligible for fewer resources and benefits than other clients. So what that looks like is a little bit different, and our toolbox is a little bit more constrained, but we have been doing it. As you note, the asylum census is down, although there still are about 54,000 recent immigrants across DHS and the non-DHS, the H&H and other agencies that are involved in the process. So it's a non-trivial number of people. Over time, I think the direction that we are heading is that DHS will be can return to being the primary sheltering agency for the city. We are very grateful for the fact that H&H and NISM and HPD stepped up in a point in time where the shelter census was increasing faster than DHS could cope. But at the end of the day, it's our mission and mandate to be the sheltering agency for the city. So we are working through plans on what exactly that looks like. I can't speak to specific addresses at this point in time, but we'll certainly happy to consult with you. I think one of the things that is going to be very important as we look to exit hotels, which I think we can all agree that hotels they're good neither for the city or for clients.
These two are hotels in particular that I'm speaking about.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm speaking to. Hotels are not great shelter. They're quite expensive, and they don't offer the appropriate community space and frankly even living space for people. That is going to be contingent on our ability to not only reduce the size of the shelter census, but replace those with more intentional sites. And so we continue to work to make sure that we are siting shelters in every district in the city.
Thank you. Council Members Wang.
Thank you, all the chairs. And also, I have some questions. I want to know, do you check the record of developers regarding poor compliance records, development violations, unpaid fines on prior building projects before entering into agreement to build more homeless shelters?
Thank you, Council Member. So there are two versions of our shelter contracts. In one of them, we are contracting, the not-for-profit is developing the site directly. Our contracts, sorry, let me take a step back. It's been a long morning already. Our contracts are always with not-for-profit organizations. We do not contract directly with developers, except in the instance where the not-for-profit is both the shelter or operator and the developer. That being, in instances where the not-for-profit is not doing the development themselves, they are leasing the site from a for-profit, typically for-profit owner. In that instance, we are looking at the lease between the not-for-profit and the developer, making sure that the lease is in accordance with all of our city policies, that we know all of the entities that are involved in the lease. This is an issue that was identified in the DOI report, that there were sometimes some fairly complicated ownership structures in those leases. This is a place where we've really been focusing to make sure that we are getting clear documentation and transparency on the property ownership structure. We want to make sure that we know who all the parties are and that the critical costs that belong with the landlord landlord. So for example, liability, insurance, those maintenance, major capital repairs, that those are all landlord responsibilities that can't be passed on to either the not-for-profit or the city. So we're looking at all the lease documentation. Once a site is up and running, we absolutely look at the physical conditions of the site and we look at administrative records, making sure that there aren't violations on the site. But beyond that, we're actually going out and in tandem with HPD and other physical inspection units to make sure that we have a clear sight line into the physical conditions of the building, and that we are. That the building is being operated in accordance with not only our standards, but the technical agencies and the State Office of Temporary and Disability Assistance, which is our oversight agency. But sort of short answer to your question, we're not doing responsibility determination on landlords because we do not contract directly with the landlords. We contract directly with the providers.
But you contract with developer, is that correct?
No. We contract with a not-for-profit shelter provider who in turn leases the building from an owner. So we are looking at the terms of the lease and we are looking at the physical condition of the building itself. We are not doing a responsibility determination on the landlord.
And then in the record, I find that you were the Sandu Group who has been awarded contract for new homeless shelter at 2147 Bass Avenue, and then current at 2501 86th Street, have a record, numbers of violations with DOB, violations such as complain about demolition without permit, then apply permit later after they demolish everything, and then have accused among $100,000 in building department fine in prior sites being built by them. For example, in Staten Island, one of the property they own has 7 violations, more than $10,000 in fines. Another one has 5 violations, more than $9,000 in fines. And another one, 10 violations and almost $19,000 in fines. And in Brown's property has 5 violations and $2,500 in fines. Queens, the property has 19 violations and $90,000 in fines. Another property in Brooklyn has 10 violations and $10,000 in fines. The Sandu Group developer is in debt to the city over $140,000 in fine. And the number of violations, which raise a valid question why the city continue to do business with this developer.
So I'm sorry, I can't speak to the specific buildings list that you mentioned. Our direct relationship is with not-for-profit providers, and we will absolutely do all of the inspection that we need to know that a building is physically appropriate for use as a shelter. It's DHS does those inspections, as does all of the physical oversight agencies of the city, as does the Office of Temporary and Disability Assistance. Construction and built property management in the city of New York is complicated. It is important to look at full spectrum of circumstances, what types of violations are there. We will make sure that any building that is being used as shelter is physically appropriate and well maintained. One of the things that has been really important to the agency over the last few years is that we continue to overall upgrade the physical stock of the shelter footprint. We have been aggressively closing buildings that do not meet our physical standards, and that is something we will continue to raise the bar on the real estate that we use as shelters.
Okay. Do you guys know the Sandu Group, who is building all the homeless shelters?
So, I'm not familiar with that particular organization. As I say, we contract not with landlords or developers, but directly with the not-for-profit shelter provider. There are a host of different real estate entities that have developed shelter over the years. I think one of the things that we have seen is real diversification in that space. I think seeing more entities come into that area, I think that is good for some of the deconcentration and making sure that we are not in thrall to any particular landlord. But again, our relationship is with not-for-profit shelter providers.
Councilmember, can you go on the second round, or do you want to keep going? Or
I have more questions.
one more? Okay.
Okay. I actually have a lot of questions. My community has been asked the question why the Sandu Group in 2017 has charged connection to the scheme by the other report they give to me. It's the City of New York investigation was the Sandu family was charged with bribery, the third degree and the Class D felony. Why the city is still working with such developer?
So I'd be happy to follow up offline. I don't have the answer off the top of my head because, as I say, we contract directly with the not-for-profit organization.
So you guys don't vet the system?
We do not do a responsibility determination or other formal process for landlords because our contract is with the not-for-profit organization. We absolutely inspect every single property that we are in, but we are not doing a portfolio-wide assessment of a developer because we don't have a contractual relationship with them.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Councilmember Ressler and Councilmember Wan. Councilmember Ressler.
Thank you so much, Chair Brewer and Chair Ayala and Chair Brannan and Chair Wan and everyone for your leadership on this very important topic. And thank you, Commissioner Park and team, for being with us today. I just had a few questions. Yeah, I appreciate that this DOI report had been many years in the making. And so when it takes a few years to put a report together, some of the findings are outdated by the time they come out, which I think you have underscored many times today. You noted in your testimony that previous administration, I think, shuttered shuttered contracts with CORE, with CCS, Bronx Parent, I don't think you mentioned, but another shady operator that we've gotten rid of in our system, as far as I know, you can confirm. The ending of cluster operations, I think, also got rid of some of the more problematic operators in the system as well. Could you share with us, the DOI report highlights that a relatively small number of providers have a large role in the system as a whole. And many of those providers do a great job and are excellent. And I should have started by saying I empathize with how hard it is to open shelters and to meet your legally mandated needs to serve people in our people who are homeless. So I know how hard this is. That being said, I just wanted to focus on some of the providers that are in the system that we're not as confident in. Which providers are currently under a corrective action plan or other form of more serious DHS oversight at this time?
So there are 6 DHS providers who are on corrective action plans. We'll circle back with the exact list. I think I prefer to keep that off of the public record for right now.
But some of those providers have very many shelters in our system.
So let me take a step back, and I should have started here.
And can I just dig into one more follow-up to that? Is there such a thing as too big to fail in our DHS system?
Took the words right out of my mouth.
Okay.
So our goal is to get not-for-profits to a point of compliance. We want good services. We need good services, and we need a robust not-for-profit sector, right? But nobody is too big to fail. CCS, for example, very, very large provider. CORE was quite a large provider. That was one I believe we closed in March 2022, so it was this administration, right? We have closed not small not-for-profits, we've closed large not-for-profits, but our toolbox is bigger than that, right? So there's nothing left. We have to end business with them. That is the solution. But before that point, we use corrective action plans as a tool to put people back on course, right? And we may put them on a cap because of financial concerns. We may do it because of programmatic concerns, but we really do see it as a technical assistance tool, right? And to monitor, and we've seen that as an effective way of getting not-for-profits to course correct. We have mandated changes to organizational structure. You mentioned Bronx Parent. believe they've changed names, but they are still in existence, but with an entirely different leadership structure, which was something that was directed and mandated by us. Right? We,
With some help from some prosecutors.
Sorry?
With help from some prosecutors.
Absolutely, but DSS, along with our colleagues at MOX, took a front and center role in making sure that those leadership changes happened and that we were getting qualified people into that organization, both as staff and board members. In at least one instance that I can think of, there is a DOI appointed monitor, again, something that we are working on very closely with MOX and with DOI. For some of the smaller not-for-profits, before something goes wrong, we put them on a capacity building agreement, right? So we want to make sure that we have a robust toolbox. Nobody is too big to fail, but the goal is to get to success.
I really appreciate that response. I do think that, as I understand it from your testimony, there are providers that are many times larger than the providers that have been shuttered in recent years that are on corrective action plans. I appreciate that corrective action plans are intended to be technical assistance and helping to provide additional support to ensure that these operators are providing the quality of services and care that our clients deserve. But it does give me concern when we have organizations that have many dozens of shelters on corrective action plans that may not be operating at the level that we all hope. The other area that I wanted to just dig in on in my last 8 seconds, sorry, Chair Brewer, is subcontracting, which is a real concern of mine, that I think we've seen some of these operators that are, I really think, borderline unethical practices where they have these for-profit subcontracting entities that provide the security services or other forms of services for the shelter. The same leadership in the shelter is getting paid multiple times over, family members and others connected to the subcontractors. What can we do to eliminate these shady and unethical subcontractor practices so that we're supporting quality nonprofit organizations to provide high caliber services? And I again want to just come back to, I realize you have a really hard job and you don't have 1,000 organizations knocking on your door every day to operate these shelters. And so you've got to do the best you can with the choices you got. But this isn't an issue of, I think, real concern. I know it's been an area that you and others have focused on. Could you elaborate on what you've done and what we could do further moving forward?
Absolutely. And I would start by saying I think the situation that you described goes beyond borderline unethical. It's just straight up unethical.
Thank you.
And we have been focused very intensively on that over the last few years. So we do have been doing tighter and tighter review of subcontracts. It's a process that is known as the 65A review, because we're good bureaucrats and there's a form for everything, but where we are really looking at not only starting with how was a subcontract procured, right? Does the provider have 3 bids to go with that subcontract? And then if they don't have the 3 bids, that's a hard line. We're not moving forward there. If they do have the 3 bids, are those bids in fact independent? Have they gone with the lowest responsible bidder? And in addition, providers are now required to submit fairly detailed conflicts of interest forms. And then we are also doing reviews of our own independent review, doing LexisNexis searches, as Councilmember Wan indicated, online searches, right, so that we are really identifying if there is a related party interaction with a sub. If we find an issue with a sub, even when it is not necessarily something nefarious, but they didn't do, they have 2 bids, they don't have 3 bids, we won't make a payment on that. So we will proceed with the invoice payment for the rest of that invoice, but we will hold back on that particular sub.
Why don't we just prohibit organizations, the senior leadership and board members of the organizations, from having a direct financial stake or immediate family members having direct financial stake in the entities that are subcontracting with those nonprofits?
Yeah, we won't do that anymore. So there was a time, obviously, as DOI found, where that was happening. We will no longer proceed with those. If we identify a related party with the subs, we're either going to sever that relationship between the vendor and the not-for-profit, or we will stop doing business with the organization.
And you do that
as a whole.
just with your own like agency latitude, with your own discretion, you choose to sever those contracts. It's not a law that is in place. It's a decision.
So this is very much driven, Mox is very much involved in this. I would say we have been quite aggressive on this over the last few years. And as I said earlier, you've probably heard complaints from some nonprofits about how long our 65A review process takes, because it does. But this has been built into the current iteration of Passport, which I'm optimistic will make us both more accountable and faster. I will say, there are some quite terrible examples of some of these related party subs, and the report calls them out. I think there's also some examples that are a little murkier, right? A not-for-profit creates a for-profit subsidiary that is a job training program, for example, like for clients. That can still be problematic, but I think not everything starts out as something nefarious. But we are very strict on our subcontract policy at this point.
I really appreciate the chance to go a little long. Bedros, it's nice to see you. I haven't seen you in a long time. Thank you for the answers, Commissioner Park. As always, appreciate your thoughtfulness and diligence.
Thank you very much, Councilmember Wan, and then Councilmember Banks.
Thank you so much, Chair Brewer. I wanted to follow up on Councilmember Sylvina Brooks-Powers and Councilmember Susan Zhuang's questions about the new closures that you've recently announced about shelters. It's really clear from what you've spoken about that you want to have equal distribution and equity for where the shelters are built. Yet when we look at a map of where the shelters are, it's 38 shelters in my district, a high density of population of shelters in Southeast Queens and Sylvina Brooks-Powers' district, Speaker Adrian Adams' district, Councilmember Salamanca's district in the Bronx, and Councilmember Althea Stevens. It's clear that when you look at it on a map, they are saturated and concentrated in the highest levels of poverty in Black and brown neighborhoods. Can you help me understand what the phases will be for closing down these shelters, in what order? Because the ones that you listed were not for equal distribution or relocation or transferring or anything like that.
Sure, thank you. Before I get to your question, I would like to make one more correction on the record. We have 12 providers on CAPS. The 6 that I mentioned are those that are on enhanced review. So I did want to correct the record. So we are absolutely committed to equal distribution of shelters across the city. As I've discussed a number of times, we've had very rapid increase of the shelter census in a very short period of time, which really dramatically increased our utilization of hotels. Hotels were frankly the only real estate that we could open in the time period that in some cases, in the peak of the asylum census, that we were opening 3 or 4 sites a week. It was incredibly challenging for DHS, and I understand for communities as well. It was what we needed to do to be able to meet our legal obligations with the number of people coming into shelter so quickly. Hotels are not distributed equally, and we had to go with the real estate that was available to us. Hotels are absolutely not the right thing to be using for shelter because they are unequally distributed, because they are expensive, because they are not good for clients. So we are highly committed to reducing our hotel footprint. The pace that we are going to be able to do that is going to depend on the reduction of the shelter census and our ability to open, well-designed, fully, more standard contracted shelters. That's something that we're working on aggressively, and we are committed to making sure that we have shelters located across the city. The list of closures that was published, I believe last week, none of those were DHS sites, or maybe one, but that was not primarily a list of DHS sites. It's something that we are working closely with our colleagues at the Mayor's Office of Asylum Seeker Operations and others as DHS takes over the role of retakes over the role as primary sheltering agency for the city. I'm not in a place where I can talk about specific close down plans right now, but certainly we will be looking at distribution of sites going forward.
So for those of us who have primarily DHS sites, then we could rest assured most likely those will not be closing.
The list that was published last week was specifically non-DHS sites. We, DHS, will be the long-term sheltering agency for the city, but as I say, I would prefer not to be using hotels at anywhere close to the same level that we are right now. So as we are able to site shelters going forward, that is something that we will look to change.
So you will be looking to have equal distribution, not concentration in black and brown neighborhoods for all these shelters?
This has been a clear policy from the start of the administration. I would say that the asylum seeker crisis certainly caused some deviation from that. We'll fully acknowledge that we had to take advantage of the hotel real estate where it existed, but we have been committed to siting shelters in districts across the city, and we will remain so.
Okay, and my last question is, DOI recommended centralizing oversight and compliance, fiscal and governance matters within MOC's vendor integrity unit. What challenges do you foresee to implement this recommendation? And can you give us more resources on what concrete steps you've now taken through the vendor compliance cabinet, and what is MOC's target timeline? Who is in this also? Who is in this special compliance cabinet?
So, Chair Wan, I'd say first on the vendor integrity unit that you mentioned. Let's speak of the vendor integrity unit is a unit within MOC's that is doing specific acts, that is really more in the day-to-day, and is going to be developing, thinking about really the same thing that the VCC will be thinking about, which is technology, procedures, and policy in order to get better outcomes here. The difference is definitely partially in the makeup, is that VIU is a MOC's unit designed to push things forward in order to reach those goals. The vendor compliance cabinet is chaired by Director Flores, the head of MOC's, and Executive Director Lebec, the head of the Mayor's Office of Risk Management and Compliance. It includes the procuring agencies, and then what I would say is kind of other oversight such as law or the Mayor's Office of Nonprofit Services are advisors and join as needed depending on the nature of the discussion. So you have those two units. In terms of the specific and concrete things that have come out of them, so as I referenced earlier, you have the anti-nepotism policy, which, as the commissioner had stated, originally started with VIU working with DSS and saying, how are we going to deal with these issues, developing these anti-nepotism procedures. Those then elevated to the VCC, to the compliance cabinet, so that we can not work in a silo, because I think that's something that's happened previously is you develop a little policy, but you haven't seen how is it going to work on the ground with your procuring agencies, talking to the ACOs, talking to the program people on the ground who actually know the accountability issues, what tools they need. So we've really put an emphasis. There is a firm structure and a charter to the vendor compliance cabinet that says, here's our goals, here's what we hope to achieve. So anti-nepotism has been is completely out on the street. We have a directive was issued this summer regarding adverse information, kind of related to a lot of what we've been talking about, enhancing those procedures of saying, agencies, if you see X, you needed to report it to Y, so that we're sharing information, we're getting all of the making sure we're getting as much of the adverse information as early as possible in order for our agencies to make the best decisions. And then I also referenced the conflicts of interest policy and related party transactions. Those have been developed, those have been drafted, they've been shared with various stakeholders, and they're up for implementation presently, and we hope to have those in place for fiscal year, for calendar year 25. And so those, I would say, are some of the concrete steps, although as I think, Chair Wan, as you know well, when we talk about vendor integrity, there are lots of places at MOC's that are concerned with vendor integrity. Outside of the VIU has specifically been put in place to drive these tech, policy, and procedural changes to improve outcomes.
So you feel confident that you will be able to centralize oversight for compliance, fiscal, and governance under the VIU?
I think so. In particular, as to the DOI report, I think we certainly agree that is what we should do, and it is what we have already started doing in creating that vendor integrity unit. I would note, to be absolutely clear, and it's referenced in our response to the DOI report, that DOI does, in phrasing this, it appears that they would envision some more enforcement roles for this vendor integrity unit. And Chair Wan, as you know very well, at MOC's, we don't hold the contracts. We are not the ones who necessarily have the tools to get in there. As the commissioner described, there are people on the ground at the agencies who are doing a lot of this. To the extent that that is in the future state, we're open to considering that. But to be clear, it is not the active state. So the VIU that is currently at Mox is not out on the street enforcing contractual requirements, because that's not the paradigm. As you know, agencies are the first line of defense there, but we are open to, I think Director Flores was saying this is stage one. And there's very much a blue sky thinking here in terms of all issues of vendor responsibility and integrity. This is stage one, and we're open to seeing where this goes.
Is there a mechanism in which all of the agencies, ACCOs, talk to each other?
Yes, there's a
and work
procurement leaders meeting once a month, where Mox and all of the, more than just ACCOs, a lot of the DACOs, a lot of MWBE officers, chief diversity officers, indeed sometimes commissioners will join our procurement leaders, which is every single month. Of course, we take someone like Vincent Pulo, the DSS ACCO, who has such an important portfolio. We're usually speaking with him and other ACCOs in some sort of working group once a week on something. So there's a once monthly, every month for many, 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 many years that all ACCOs go to. But also, I think, especially when you consider things like the VCC and these working groups and these procedures, we're holding a lot of informal gatherings of ACCOs in the human services space, ACCOs in the construction space, and really because they're going to see they have the boots on the ground and they see the issues in real time. So we can't improve the procedures and the policies if we're not working hand in hand with our ACCO shops.
And last question, I promise. Why did Mox reject several of DOI's recommendations regarding systems and data management? Are you doing alternative approaches?
Is there a specific recommendation you were thinking of, Chair?
Do you remember? We'll get back to you.
Okay, and happy to have any further discussions, of course.
Thank you.
You should invite her to the procurement meetings. They'll be going on for a long time.
Indeed.
I love her questions. We're welcoming Middle School 158. I think they are in. Welcome, school. Councilmember Palladino's district. Welcome, welcome. Glad you're here. Next is Councilmember Stevens and then Banks.
Hello, good afternoon. I guess for me, some of the questions I always have, and just think about when we're thinking about even the landscape of nonprofits and the contracting in the city, we have a lot of nonprofits who hold a lot of contracts with the city. And so I'm just trying to get a better understanding of how is that evaluated when we're thinking about new contracts, and especially like with shelters, because that's such a big overhaul. And because I feel like a lot of times we look at them as jack of all trades, and that's not the case. And so are we looking to start thinking about maybe having more of an evaluation and factoring that in to kind of get people to stay more in a niche, because often people are following the money and the trends, and so they'll jump and put their hats in the ring to have all these different contracts. So how's that taken into consideration when thinking about giving out a contract, especially for something as big as a shelter?
Thank you, Councilmember. Very good question. So when we're reviewing a proposal that comes in through our open-ended RFP, which is how we solicit and review new shelter proposals, one of the criteria that we're looking at is provider capacity. And we're looking to balance two things. One is some level of experience, right? I think providing shelter services is a skill in and of itself. It is challenging. There's particular both operational and human service skill sets that are needed, and also compliance with city government rules and regulations, as we've been talking about all morning, right, is challenging. So we're looking to balance experience with also capacity and bandwidth.
But if we're only looking, because I understand the capacity piece, but even with the experience, sometimes that takes new people out of the running because they're not able to do it. And we often know that sometimes the city goes to specific folks and say, I need you to take this contract. Right. And that happens often.
So, yeah, so sorry, let me finish the thought here. So, one of the ways that we look at experience is we try to take a broad definition so that it includes not just have you run a shelter in New York City, because then we're only ever going to the same pool. Have you operated shelter elsewhere in another jurisdiction? Or maybe you haven't operated shelter any place, but you have other human service contracts with the city of New York that provides a relevant skill set. So we want
But I think even with that gets really hard, because even with the model it has, right, because we run on a reimbursement policy, that also takes a lot of people out of running. You have to have a certain amount of endowment, and you have to have the money up front to put it forward. So if we're going to the same group of people, which is why I think when we're thinking about payment, we're putting people in a cycle of poverty, because now they have multiple contracts with the city who they have to pay up front, and then we know that they're all being paid late. And so even by definition of the way we're thinking about giving out contracts, we are putting organizations at a deficit.
Right. So we've added about a dozen new providers over the last 2 years. I think one of the very few silver linings of growing very rapidly is that we have been able to bring in a number of new providers. Some of those are relatively large organizations that just haven't done work with DHS before, but many of them are quite small organizations. We do recognize that contracting with the city can be complicated. We are looking to provide technical assistance and support to organizations to do that. So we offer, for example, what we call our capacity building agreement, which is really hands-on technical assistance work to support not-for-profits that wanted to do business with the city.
I have one more question, so I'm just going to stop you there, and we can definitely continue the conversation, because I do think we need to get to a place where we're looking at all the players that are getting these contracts and then trying to make sure that we're balancing it out, because, we do have a group of folks, and when you look at some of the executive salaries, they have a lot of the city's contracts. And so I think even some of the questioning from my colleagues can speak to that of like, well, then how are we justifying this, right? So we have, folks making $500,000 and then they're getting, the bulk of the contracts from the city, it becomes a problem. So I think we definitely need to be looking at the bigger spectrum, like as RFPs are coming in, how many contracts they have at DSS, DYCD, ACS, and all these different things, because a lot of these organizations over the spectrum are getting a lot of contracts from the city. And here's the thing, I'm not saying that they don't do good work, but what I'm saying is we also have to think about like how are we also evaluating it for them to get the RFPs, and then thinking about how are we eliminating other people from getting them. I mean, one of the biggest ways is that we are on reimbursement, but that's not your fault, but we're gonna work on that. And then my last question is also to, and I think I've asked this question before in different iterations, but because I'm always baffled about when we're thinking about shelters, and I know you don't lease to landlords, but so I just want to make sure the providers are the ones responsible for finding locations for shelters and not DHS. You guys are not the ones citing it. So the provider are the ones coming to you saying like, hey, I have this space, or I have this deal with this landlord, let's do this, and then you approve their contract, and that's how the process works.
Essentially, yes. So one of the threshold criteria for when you're applying through our open-ended RFP, when a not-for-profit is applying through open-ended RFP, is that they have some form of site control. That doesn't necessarily mean that they have an executed lease, something like that, but it means that they at least have a letter of intent from a landlord. So they have to find the site, but we can review a site and say this does or doesn't work as shelter, right? So, and that could be for a whole variety of reasons, right? It could be that it's too small, it's too big, it's too...
Is it ever because this location has so many shelters in the area?
Yes, absolutely.
How often does that happen?
More often than you would think.
Interesting. It doesn't happen so much in my district, but you've been nice to me, so I'm not going to be mean today. But I think that that's something that we definitely even think about in the process of like, are there areas we should just like say, this is a frozen zone for right now because it's so saturated, and how do we move forward? Because I think even with providers, if they are like, oh, we need to find the space, they're just going to go out and they're not looking to think like, oh, is there another shelter down the block, or is there one in the area? Because like that's not their landscape. Real estate is ridiculous in the city right now, and so it also puts them in a position where they're not able to like provide. And so I think we need to think about what does that look like, for the next RFPs that are coming out.
Happy to collaborate on that.
Absolutely. So we'll definitely talk soon. Thank you.
Councilmember Banks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, good to see you, Commissioner. I just want to know, are there any shelters slated for the 42nd Council District to open up? Any new shelters slated?
I don't have my list of shelter openings with me, but I'm happy to follow up offline.
And then the list of closures, any slated closures?
Happy to follow up offline.
All right, well, we look forward to that information. Now, I want to dive deeper into the services that the shelters provide, particularly the sponsors, like Samaritan Village, which is has quite a couple of shelters in my district. I believe SUS, which is also another proprietor shelters in the district. In the 42nd Council District, I want to know when you the deliverables that they are obligated to provide for the residents in the shelter. Who provides the oversight when it comes to that? And because we've had multiple conversations with a lot of the providers in the district, and we don't see this, we don't hear or even see the social services that are being provided. A lot of the residents are roaming the streets. They put out at a certain time, and we see that constantly. And listen, I don't, you know, it seems like that just creates a war on homeowners, business owners, on our community. And I want to know exactly what's being done by these providers when they get in. I mean, are we just providing food and shelter, or are these providers obligated contractually to provide some type of social service, whether it's mental health, life skills, you name it?
Right. So let me just start with one clarification for the record. We do not, and haven't for, I don't know, 10 or 15 years, require shelters to close during the day. That was the policy, and I know many people believe that it still is. Clients can they can stay indoors during the day. That they are not required to, but they can. I just wanted to make sure that we were all on the same page there.
Well, let me ask you this: during the day, during the times when the shelter is open, what services are there? Services that are available for the residents?
So every shelter has some form of wraparound services. What that looks like is going to depend. There's some things that are consistent across every shelter, right? So every shelter is going to have caseworkers. That is a mandated ratio from the Office of Temporary and Disability Assistance, our state oversight agency. Virtually every site has housing specialists, people who are focused on permanent housing placements. I say virtually every, and a handful of sites, it's the caseworkers also doing that work. But and then beyond that, the specific nature of the services is going to vary a little bit depending on what population served, right? So families with children, sets of services are going to look a little bit different than single adults. And then within single adults, we have different types of program shelters. So we have shelters that are geared towards people who are employed or employable. We have shelters that are geared towards seniors, to people with behavioral health diagnoses. So it ranges. But absolutely every site has social services, and the expectation is that people are focused on social service provision and on permanent housing placements.
Can you tell me the services that Samaritan Village provides? There's a 200-bed women's shelter right on Van Sicklen and New Lots. And from even speaking to some of the residents that live there, they say there's no services being provided to them. So I don't know what you're seeing on your level, but it's not trickulating down to the ground of the folks who are in the shelters. Just like the 100, and I think it's a 200-bed men's shelter right on Blake, right across from the Betty Shabazz Clinic in East New York. There are a lot of residents in there that have mental health issues, but there's some residents in there that don't have mental health issues and want services. We've had conversations with them, and they're saying that they're not getting the services from the particular service provider. So what are you doing to make sure that we're not just, like I would always say, keeping poor people poor and keeping this business of sheltering going and really providing services to the residents so they can become productive, and even those folks who have mental health issues? What are we doing to assist them, to help them?
Sure, absolutely. And happy to follow up on specifics of different sites offline. But generally speaking, right, making sure that we have viable on-site services, but also a really important is that we have a strong referral network. I don't want to be in a situation ever where somebody's access to mental health care, for example, is contingent on their being in shelter.
Right.
So one of the things that is really important to us is that our providers are referring out to community for people with more serious behavioral health needs. That could mean completing an application for one of the city's mobile health crisis teams, right? IMT, ACT, things like that. And we actually have shelter-based ACT teams. I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to look up what ACT stands for, but they're state and city mental health funded mental health teams that are really designed to deal with people with the most serious needs. For other people, that is making sure that they have access to primary care physicians, right? That kind of referral has been met. It could mean, connection to the right employment services. All of this is voluntary. Nobody's required to receive services in order to be in shelter. It is always a work in progress. And as I have said earlier,
it's been a work in progress for quite some time.
I'm never gonna be here to say that DHS is perfect. We absolutely have.
Well, I don't want perfection.
We absolutely have staff who are out on a regular basis, who are working with the providers, who are looking at metrics like how many permanent housing placements have they made. If there are, when we identify an incident or trends where we have concerns about provider performance, we will double down on them. We can put providers on caps for performance issues. It's not just for financial accountability, but really, I think for the most part, what we see is that we do have a robust network of wraparound services. One of the performance metrics that I am absolutely the most focused on is those permanent housing placements, because shelter should be a short-term emergency solution. Last year, we had about 18,500 permanent housing placements, which is a record.
Well, listen, it's easy to sit here in City Hall and to regurgitate that and to say that, but I would encourage you, if you would come and take a tour with me through my district, and we can speak to some of the shelter residents, and I'll let them express the same thing I expressed to you.
Happy to do it.
Right.
Thank
you. I know that the commissioner has to leave at 1. I just have one question. The people who are sometimes coming into the shelter come from off the street, and my understanding is that there's an $8 million hotspot funding cut that DHS is proposing for those who are doing the outreach. Can you just talk about that? Because it does seem to me that that's going to cut an awful lot of outreach workers who do help keep people off the street and then go into your shelters.
Yeah, street outreach is some of the most challenging and most important work that we do. I think you probably heard me say this last night, council member. I think street outreach is probably the hardest job in the city of New York, and we are totally committed to it. We have a number of places in our budget where there's funding that, for a whole variety of reasons, isn't baselined. So this isn't a place where we're requesting a cut, but where we're working with OMB to address funding needs on a year-by-year basis. But we are completely committed to our street outreach.
But we need the $8 million back. We do not need it cut. We are losing people who will be keeping those off the street.
We are working very closely with OMB on that.
Okay, I will keep talking about that. Council Member Wan, to close it out, because the commissioner has to leave, if you have a quick question.
I just wanted to make sure that I got to ask this question before you left. There was an article on November 20th in Hellgate that exposed the city and state's lack of city and state's oversight on halal certification for migrant shelters and the food that they're getting. The site in question was a city-run migrant site where a for-profit vendor was providing halal food that were not only bad quality, I believe it was Riviera Caterings, because I have the same issue at a Stell place in my district, where Riviera, I've had multiple constituents complain that it was not halal food. So they are continuing to claim inaccurately that they are halal, and despite the protest of Muslim migrants. What is the city's plan to reform the oversight process to ensure that meals are appropriate for halal observing clients and that there is no fraudulent claims like that?
So I'm going to confirm and we'll follow up with you, but I believe that was not in the DHS system, so which limits my ability to speak to the specifics. We absolutely take people's food needs very seriously, whether they are religious or dietary. And to the best of my knowledge, we have not had specific complaints on that within the DHS system, but I will certainly follow up.
So does DHS have follow a certification process? Because there is a halal certification countrywide that you can receive to serve halal food.
So in most instances, the way that food is delivered within the DHS system is that the provider typically has a subcontract for their food vendor. We obligate people to those providers to meet the religious and dietary needs of clients, and so the providers are obligated to provide, halal or kosher or whatever the specifics are. As I say, it is something that, and we have a dietitian on staff whose job it is to monitor compliance with dietary restrictions, as well as the team that oversees our reasonable accommodations, which is typically how specific meals are requested. So we have a lot of eyes on that. As I say, I don't believe this was within the DHS system, but I will triple check and get back to you.
Okay, because just talking about food overall, the food quality continues to be disgusting and pungent. We had to meet with your team for Paper Factory Hotel because the shelter residents were providing the food back to us again, asking us to smell it, to look at it. It was from Riviera Caterers. So Riviera and Regina's Caterers continue to get mass amounts of food subcontracts in the DHS system, even though the food quality has been proven time and time again to be inedible. And we're spending more than $500 million on all of these foods that are inedible.
So we work very hard to make sure that all of our providers are adhering to the city's food standards. As council members, I know we've discussed, that means limitations on calories, sugar, salt, and fat. So it is very prescriptive. But we are also actively working to bring more vendors into the food space. We think this is an area that is very ripe for MWBE partnerships. So we've been doing a lot of what we call our matchmaking events, where we're bringing together providers who are our prime contractors with subcontractors in various fields. Particularly, food is an area of focus. We think that is good from a business development standpoint, and also brings more competition and more options into the space.
Because I think a partner like Rethink Foods is the ultimate matchmaker, where we know that our city's contracting funds will be recirculated into our local economy to our restaurants directly. And we know that the food tastes good because it's made locally from a restaurant, the food that you and I would eat for lunch.
I would just cancel all the contracts and give it to Rethink. Understood. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner and staff, and we look forward to working with you. Thank you very much for your testimony. Public testimony. I open the hearing for public testimony. I remind members that this is a government proceeding. Decorum shall be observed. The public needs to be silent at all times. The witness table is reserved for people who wish to testify. No video recording or photography is allowed from that table. Members of the public may not present audio or video recordings as testimony, but you can submit transcripts of such recordings to the Sergeant at Arms for inclusion in the hearing record. I think most of you have already filled out an appearance card, but if not, talk to the Sergeant at Arms and you will fill it out and then be recognized. When recognized, you'll have 2 minutes to speak on today's oversight hearing topic, which you know is examining the administration's oversight of city-funded homeless shelter providers or Intro 979. If you have a written statement or written testimony and you want to submit it for the record, provide a copy to the Sergeant at Arms. You may also email any testimony to testimony@council.nyc.gov within 72 hours of the close of the hearing. Audio and video recordings will not be accepted. For in-person, please come up to the table once your name has been called. And now I will call on the committee staff to call the witness slips, or I will call the witness slips. Go ahead.
The first panel will be Graham Horn, Terry Troya, Kristen Miller, and Timothy Pena. Please come up to the front.
Whomever would like to start, go ahead.
Good afternoon. Thank you for holding this oversight hearing and for the opportunity to speak with you all today. My name is Graham Horn. I'm a staff attorney with the Shelter and Economic Stability Project at New York Legal Assistance Group. The city fails to provide adequate oversight of its shelter system in numerous ways, as has been highlighted today in testimony. I will bring attention to the fact that there is no clear, effective process to investigate and resolve shelter residents' complaints, whether they concern city-run shelters or those operated by nonprofit organizations under contract with the city. This lack of oversight has led to excessive deference to shelter providers, often at the expense of our clients' rights. The city must implement stronger oversight mechanisms and ensure that shelter providers are held accountable. The physical conditions in many city shelters are quite simply abysmal. Clients frequently report filthy environments, including being provided with beds that lack sheets or have dirty sheets previously used by other occupants. Infestations of roaches, mice, even rats are widespread. In some cases, clients, doctors, and social workers contact us to report severe medical issues caused by these conditions, including rodent bites and chewed medical equipment, tubing, and wiring. Conditions in the new shelters created exclusively for newly arrived immigrants are even worse. NILAC clients routinely report negative and harmful experiences with staff at intake centers and shelters. Clients report particularly aggressive treatment at shelter intake sites. Many of my clients remain street homeless not because they refuse to seek shelter, but because they are unable to navigate the difficult and hostile intake process. Some believe they were denied shelter because security guards or front desk staff told them they were ineligible before they could even apply. Once in shelter, many clients continue to face hostile and aggressive behavior from staff. This is especially harmful for clients living with severe mental illnesses, which can make adhering to rigid shelter rules particularly challenging. I will follow up.
Just wrap up.
Okay, thank you. Clients' frequent report of thefts committed by shelter staff reveal the extent to which oversight and accountability are absent in the city shelters. This could possibly be accomplished through a CCRB-style organization, independent agency empowered to receive, investigate, make findings, and recommend action on complaints. Thank you all, and thank you especially Chair Juan and co-sponsors for your efforts to improve provision of food in city shelters.
Thank you very much, and you'll be submitting your testimony.
I will.
Go ahead.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Kristen Miller, and I'm Executive Director of Homeless Services United, HSU, which represents about 50 nonprofit shelter and homeless service providers across New York City. We thank you all for your ongoing support of people experiencing homelessness and those nonprofits that provide services to them. Today, the Council is looking at DOI's report examining the risk of corruption in organizations contracted with DHS. As we've been talking about, this examination began over 4 years ago. Our members strive to operate top-notch programs that operate in full compliance with the multitude of oversight required of them. We've talked about it today. This includes annual audits, random audits, financial filings with the city, state, federal government, reporting to all funders, whether public or private, and of course the IRS. Audits serve an important purpose, to root out nefarious activities. In fact, the DOI report did find some bad actors, which were not members of ours, and are no longer doing business with the city in most cases. And that's how it should be. However, this 101-page report went on to engage hypotheticals, pointing out possible areas of risk for corruption, not corrupt activities, and areas in which the city must provide clearer reporting guidelines. My members welcome succinct policies and procedures so that they are easily able to comply with the oversight required of them. The alarming issue, however, is the amount of money owed to nonprofits, often due to the inability of DSS to process budget actions in a consistent and timely manner. I last testified to the council about this in June, where I reported members owed as much as $30 million. I'm sad to say today that number is close to $50 million per organization, not in total, but some organizations are owed $50 million by DSS. I'm calling on the council today, if I may finish, thank you, to demand that the city provide resources to DSS so that mountains of budget actions can quickly be processed and approved. Until the city puts resources into this paperwork needed to process the paperwork needed for approvals, we will never dig our way out of this. Just want to comment, in my testimony, I go into detail about the food bill 979. The one thing I'll just note is that we, of course, want to provide quality food, but our budgets provide between $5 and $12 per day per individual. Going with local businesses would be wonderful. What local business is going to provide a day's worth of food for $5? Food prices, as we all know, have gone through the roof. Our budgets have not increased. Nearly impossible to provide quality food on $5 a day. In conclusion, I just want to say that the nonprofit sector that serves our homeless residents is in crisis. And without substantive and immediate intervention, many of our agencies will be forced to make some extremely difficult decisions in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Good afternoon. My name is Timothy Pena. I run an organization called Veterans Justice Project. I'm also a veterans advocate. I spent 5 months at Borden Avenue, which is a federally funded grant per diem program for honorably discharged veterans. Going back to what she just said about the food, their budget is $6.60 a day for meals. The kitchen's closed because they had Project Renewal running a culinary school out of there. There's no food. No food can come in. And the trays that they get, the flat trays, after being picked through to, I assume, to fill out the black trays that go out to the shelters, are usually just cold rice and green beans. I lost 28 pounds in 5 months. We had a veteran who overdosed and died again last week. This is a violent shelter where DHS is bringing in millions of dollars from the federal government to provide services to us who have served. I'm a disabled veteran, and I'm not quite understanding how Department of Homeless Services can sit here and point the finger at the vendors when I met with ICL last week, who told me that DHS are the ones who are keeping us in violent shelters. If we object, we are transferred out of the GPD program without cause. We are also then taken out of the HUD-VASH program. We are left on the streets, literally, with no place to go. There's no women's GPD program in this city. So women veterans who are experiencing homelessness have only one place to go, and that's a shelter. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Who's a nonprofit running Borden Avenue now?
Institute for Community Living.
It is that, okay. Terry, go ahead.
Hi. Oh, right, sorry. Thank you, Councilwoman Brewer, and all the council people here this day. My name is Terry Troya. I'm a local Staten Island pastor and president of Project Hospitality. We're founded in 1982 by local houses of worship on Staten Island to serve homeless people and to welcome them into our sanctuaries. We opened the doors back in 1984, way before there was a DHS or there was a dime from the city to help homeless people on Staten Island, and I'm still there. We provide so many services, a continuum of care in our borough, and we're very proud of the work that we do and the work that we do in concert and partnership with DHS. Today we provide a 24-hour drop-in center, a family shelter for 43 homeless families, 30-bed safe haven for chronic street homeless people, and 3 city sanctuary shelters for the arriving asylum seekers. But in the last 3 years, we have encountered a problem getting reimbursement of our DHS contract expenses. In the last 2 years, we have taken out three loans, and it's been very difficult for us to sustain lines of credit and leverage that with collateral from the agency. On May 2nd, I met with Deputy Mayor Isom about our cash flow problems. She connected us with the DSS CFO, Vincent Pulo, who has been just marvelous towards us. We actually met with him this morning again by phone. 2 months after we met, we got all of our bills paid for 2022 from the DHS contracts. We were owed in July $5.9 million that has been paid by the city. We are now owed $5.4 million for 2023 and 2024. We've had to take out $7 million in credit to make payroll over the last several months. We have had to leverage all of our agency assets, which are not much, and we're going to account for $100,000 in interest this year on our line of credit, and that's the sum total of the money that we have raised so far in the last 6 months. People don't give us money to pay interest on lines of credit. They give us money to open up food pantries and soup kitchens, and we urge the city to review the reimbursement process in order to find a way to pay nonprofit service providers in a more expedient manner. We can't sustain the loans. We can't sustain the interest. We are not sustainable. We are sinking fast as a viable not-for-profit on Staten Island, and the water is over our heads.
Thank you all. I mentioned that earlier when I was asking questions. So thank you all. We will be in touch.
Thank you.
This is a lot of follow-up. Thank you.
The next panel will be Jim Tranks, Elliot Schildkraut, Pat O'Connell, and Barbara Hughes. Apologies if I messed up any of those names. Please come to the witness stand.
All right, go ahead if you like, whomever, go ahead.
Me first. My name is Barbara Hughes, and I'm the Executive Director of City Beat Kitchens at Project Renewal. We're a New York City Homeless Services nonprofit agency. Thank you, Chair Brewer and the City Council for convening this hearing. For over 55 years, Project Renewal has provided shelter, housing, health care, and employment services to New Yorkers experiencing homelessness. We are grateful to the City Council for supporting our programs. Our social enterprise catering company, City Beat Kitchens, is unique because it employs many graduates of our Project Renewal Culinary Arts Training Program. This workforce development program provides New Yorkers facing barriers to employment, including veterans, with a world-class culinary education and a pathway to a fulfilling career. City Beat Kitchens prepares high-quality food for providers across the city. At this time, nearly 2,500 daily meals for 18 nonprofit sites and 2,800 daily meals for Project Renewal's 7 shelters. We also cater private and corporate events. Profits from the business are reinvested in our culinary training program to provide even more employment opportunities. Intro 979 would place undue burden on nonprofit caterers like us. In recent years, food prices have risen by 20%, paper products 25%, gas 54%, van repairs 43%, yet the food budget for shelter meals has remained the same. Requiring nonprofit providers who are obligated to provide a meal for all of our shelter residents to document food consumption and waste will add another costly layer of administrative burden. We are deeply concerned about an unfunded mandate at a time when the city has been chronically late to pay nonprofit providers for our work. The best way to reduce food waste in shelters is to simply improve the quality of food. Think about it, if you had an unappetizing meal placed in front of you, would you force yourself to eat it? Or would you try to go to a nearby soup kitchen or pantry for something better? When poor quality food is wasted, the city is paying
Well, we got to
twice
wrap up.
over.
Wrap up.
Can I finish my, at City Beat Kitchens, we take pride in crafting quality dishes and diverse menus for shelter residents. The City Council should consider prioritizing social enterprise caterers like us over for-profit food contracts. The return on investment with caterers like us is strong. We provide high-quality meals for New Yorkers in need, which reduces food waste while supporting workforce development to create opportunities for those who face barriers to employment.
Thank you. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much, Councilmember Brewer and all other council members for the hearing today. My name is Pat O'Connell. I've been living and working in New York City for 41 years. I currently live in the Upper West Side, here representing a number of neighbors who are on the street, where an old school building was recently purchased by a private equity company that is starting to make tens of millions of dollars on a small investment. So the way I see the problem is what I call an arm's length relationship between the city and these private equity funds. So my heart was breaking today when I heard the commissioner, as well as this lady here, the other people, about the challenges in the health industry, or in the shelter business, I should say. But I think we're not really discussing what I call the elephant in the room, which are that some of these private equity firms making, collectively hundreds of millions of dollars. So specifically, without mentioning any company or any place, but you have a combination of real estate companies selling buildings to private equity companies under one guise, and then the private equity company does a deal with one of the shelter providers. And in this particular case that I'm talking about, the building was sold for $15 million. The private equity company put on $5 million with a mortgage of $9.6 million, and they're going to stand to make something like $28 million in 9 years. So not only will they pay off their mortgage, they'll also be able to get back their investment, but they're making essentially $28 million and $5 million investment. As best we know, this company is doing this in multiple places in the city. So this one private equity firm stands to make hundreds of millions of dollars. And I don't blame anybody here, but it's a case of inadvertently, the city is giving money into private hands. So I would just ask you to think about that as you look at other issues. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you both very much. I know you're talking about, I'm happy to mention it, Bayrock, and I am totally opposed to what they're doing. I know there are others who feel the same way, and we continue to fight. Thank you very much. Thank you both.
The next panel will be Elena Rostovsky, Matt Joswiak, Sharon Brown, and Muma Lacey.
Whomever would like to begin, go ahead.
Dear chairs, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Elena Ristovsky, and I'm the Director of Operations and Programs at Marlowe Bistro, an independent Mediterranean restaurant located on the Upper West Side. I'm proud to testify today in the support of Intro 979, sponsored by Chair 1. This important legislation aims to improve our understanding of shelter food contracts and explore how the city, nonprofits, and small businesses can collaborate more effectively to deliver high-quality, culturally relevant meals to homeless New Yorkers. We want to share with you today how our participation in the city's shelter food contracts has allowed us to optimize our infrastructure, minimize food waste, and not only to retain but grow our workforce during challenging times. Even more, we reinforce our ties in the community and proven the values of applying a pay-it-forward culture. Because of this support, we in return are able to give forward by supporting our local soup kitchens, food banks, and neighbors in need, whether through donating nutritional meals or hiring local staff. Furthermore, our partnership with Rethink Food and the City of New York has enabled Marlowe Bistro to expand our team by 15 employees and generate over $1 million in revenue, contributing meaningfully to the local economy. By facilitating more thoughtful and adaptive food procurement practices, this legislation has the power to significantly improve the quality and cultural relevance of meals served in New York City's homeless shelters, and at the same time support the small restaurants, reinforcing their importance as cultural and economic cornerstone. Thank you so much for your time and consideration.
Next, go ahead.
Hello, my name is Sharon Brown Jeter, and I am here from Rose of Sharon Enterprises. Keep Israel in your thoughts and prayers and the things that you're doing. We want the hostages released, and we want Yahweh's people to be let go. Okay, all the people in America and worldwide have a right to have a home. They have a right to have a shelter, which is a home, an apartment or house. We are not going to warehouse bodies in shelters anymore. The word shelter means the same thing that you and I live in, an apartment or a house, not a shelter. We are no longer building shelters and then saying, oh my goodness, we're gonna get it right this time. Oh my gosh, did we not feed them the right food this time? Are we still getting the bad food from these people? So what did they eat during that time? So they're not getting the funding that they need. Put them inside of the empty apartments that we know are there because they're in the papers. We don't need more shelters. We have people that are rallying to say, let's get more low-income apartments. Build apartments. If you can build a short shelter, build a tall apartment. Let the people come out and rally about how tall the building is because you've put people inside and cured the homeless problem. Let them yell at us for curing the homeless problem, not for continually building shelters that we are clear does not work. So the shelter idea, we're going to torpedo that. That's not going to happen anymore. We're moving forward and making sure that people are not going to be forced into mental programs so they can go into jail over and over, go into shelter. So people go from shelter to shelter to shelter. Put people in houses where they belong. God has made it available for everyone.
Thank you very much.
You're
Next.
welcome.
Hi, my name is Mount Lacey. I'm a disabled veteran. I was in Borden Avenue. I'd like to just tell a little story that'll hit on a few key points that you guys have gone back and forth over, which I would say is akin to lying children to absentee parents. This meeting has been absolutely nauseating. I was attacked in the veteran shelter in the restroom. I was the one given charges. It was as simple as showing the security video to the police officers, which they refused to do that. Now, because of the evidence that I did collect while I was there, because I don't care about your no recording policy, as I do respect the HIPAA rights, I do not condone the negligence and abuse of the shelter workers, which is our only recourse is to record it. Because of the evidence that I did collect, DHS has systematically kept me from the proper shelter and transferred me to the worst shelters in the system, Blake being one of them, Jerome being another, Myrtle Avenue being another, and done so because they know I have the proof on this camera. And I wonder when is there going to be a meeting where I will be, or who will be interested in seeing it. With a $4 billion budget and 56,000 homeless residents, that's $70,000 per resident you are spending on each homeless one. You guys do not want to fix the problem. There's too much money coming in for it. You guys want to just keep rallying around these nebulous problems instead of actually getting to the issues, and it's sickening. Thank you, Julie Wan, for the tough questions you asked. And thank you, Christopher Banks, for inviting them to eat that food. You guys should go to the shelter at least once a month and eat a meal. Get your heads out of the ground.
Thank you.
Thank you, and I want to thank the council members today for bringing this together, and especially Councilmember Wan and Councilmember Brewer for your relentless attention to the food qualities in our shelter system. I do want to thank the administration because in the last 7 years that I've been running Rethink Food, I've seen more progress in the last 2 than I have in the entire time that I've been making emergency food. We have been able to work with a lot of the smaller shelters and have a great relationship with health and hospitals, but one critical lesson that we've uncovered over the last 6 months is the immense amount of food waste in the shelter system. While food waste is certainly a sustainability issue, it is also a fiscal issue, a matter of fiscal responsibility. We've identified that there could be around $200 million worth of food waste in the system as of today. $200 million is a number that is equal to the entire city budget of Albany. Could employ every firefighter, every worker, everybody in that city. And this problem extends past this issue because of the fact that folks need to eat. They end up going to soup kitchens and pantries, which 10s, 20s, unmeasurable amounts of money, millions and millions of dollars are raised by philanthropies every year to do the same job that the city is supposed to be doing. We're throwing away the food for the taxpayers' dime, and then people are walking around the corner and nonprofits are having to dig money out of their pockets to make meals for these communities. It's a really simple solution. We just need to prepare better food, and you can't fix what you don't measure, which is why Rethink Food is strongly in favor of this law. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have one question for you. So I obviously said, as Councilmember Juan did, we should work with you. I think I said it probably out of turn, which is my norm. But my question is, how do you make the numbers work? Are you able to make the numbers work despite the low numbers?
Yes, we can operate between, the lowest we've been able to go is around $9.50 to $10 a day. We do this at a loss for our organization, council member. Our organization will lose money, but the way that we look at it is if we make better food for 50 cents that we lose on that meal, then we don't have to feed them down the street for $5 a person, and so the math makes sense for us.
Thank you very much.
Our last witness is on Zoom, Rafiq Umar. You can start whenever you're ready.
Time starts.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yep, we can hear you.
Perfect. Dear respected members of the City Council, my name is Imam Mansour Rafiq Umar. I'm the President and CEO of Halal Watch World, first and only halal certification agency based in the Capital Region and upstate New York. As a leading certifier for nearly 4 decades, we've worked tirelessly to ensure halal integrity, providing trusted oversight for halal-conscious consumers and organizations. I've also served as the head chaplain of SUNY Albany, and additionally, I was appointed by Governor Hochul last year to the Interfaith Council as the only Muslim imam. We also represent 43 schools throughout New York City in oversight and ensuring that products are halal and those products are proper for the students to be consuming. One of the biggest issues that was mentioned at the end of the council members' speaking points is that there is an issue with integrity from the halal perspective. So products that are going into the shelters, the question will always be had is, are these products actually halal? And that's one of the things that we do is we make sure that those products are halal. The products that are currently going into the shelters, there are a lot of questions around them. We've looked at the documentation that's been submitted to the Agriculture Markets Database, and there are issues with the products where it states that they're mixing halal and non-halal foods, that they are self-certifying. Those are the types of problems and issues that we want to ensure do not ever occur for our Muslim constituents and halal-conscious consumers. Rethink Foods, Marlowe Bistro, those are the types of locations that are properly vetted. We ensure that they properly follow the Islamic guidelines and standards. And our goal is to ensure that there is integrity and oversight. So we would love to work with the council in whatever.
Your time has expired. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't know if any of my colleagues have closing statements or anything you want to add. Does anybody? No? Anybody down here? Okay. Thank you very much. This hearing is going to conclude, but not to say that I want to be really clear. There'll be lots of follow-up. I appreciate both the city administration and those who testified. This is a very important topic, and we will be following up. And thank you to the staff.